A play was written many years ago in memory of a long-dead Egyptian king. Two young women were chosen to play the leading roles. The play was the whim of an American writer who thought to poke fun at ancient Egyptian superstition. Legend had it that the priests of Egypt cursed their dead king to wander aimlessly through eternity. They did this by forbidding anyone to speak his name.
We call out the name Akhenaten.
That night, both women had eerie dreams about the cursed king, Akhenaten. One, that she was struck across the face. In the morning, she was nearly blind. Coincidence? Or was there another force involved? A curse, working its evil way after nearly 4,000 years. The priests of Egypt had enormous power. Not even the Pharaoh was immune from their vengeance.
This series presents information based in part on theory and conjecture. The producer's purpose is to suggest some possible explanations, but not necessarily the only ones, to the mysteries we will examine.
Egypt. It was already a great nation 3,000 years before Christ was born. Its kings built enormous monuments during their lifetimes. By the 20th century, 33 royal tombs had been excavated in the Valley of the Kings. The most exciting discovery, however, was still to come. It would be the culmination of a sequence of events that began not in Egypt, but in the green fields of England. The Berkshire Downs. Highclere Castle is the ancestral home of the Earls of Carnarvon. The lord who presided here in the first quarter of this century would help make history. It would cost him dearly, however. The Earl did not leave the comfort of his castle and embark on the adventurer's trail by choice. A curious chain of events compelled him to go to Egypt. The present Lord Carnarvon remembers very well how it began.
First of all, my father had a serious accident in Germany, a motor accident, and he was rather badly injured. He also suffered from rather weak lungs, so his doctors said to him, doesn't matter where you go, but you must go to a dry, warm climate every year from now on in the winter months. So Papa said to himself, well, that's a fine kettle of fish. He likes shooting and everything else. So he decided that he'd go off at the end of the shooting season by the beginning of February, and he went to Egypt.
The rhythm of life along the Nile was a radical change for the Earl.
After he'd been there a few months, Lord Cromer was sent for him and said, my dear Porchy, he said, if you're coming out here regularly, you're going to be so bored you won't know what to do with yourself. So may I make a suggestion? Yes, indeed, I'd be honored if you tell me what to do. Right, he said, why don't you take up as a hobby Egyptology? He said, it's very interesting. And what's more, he said, it happens that at this moment of time, I've got the very fellow who will help you best. He happens to be an awfully nice young man called Howard Carter.
Howard Carter was an intense, driven man. After 15 years with the British Civil Service in Egypt, he'd been fired for refusing to apologize to his superior. Carter stayed on in Egypt because he had a dream. By the time Lord Carnarvon returned to England, he'd agreed to bankroll that dream. 15 years after the bargain was struck, Carter still labored in the Valley of the Kings. His dream? To find the tomb of King Tutankhamun. Professional archaeologists thought the valley had been picked clean years before. Carter disagreed. The search was exasperating. Carnarvon was threatening to cut the money off when in November 1922, Carter unearthed a staircase. At the bottom, a door with royal seals intact. The door had been sealed more than 3,000 years before. Carter couldn't be sure he'd found Tutankhamun's tomb, but whatever lay behind the door was bound to make his years of toil worthwhile.
And at that moment, he got to the stage where he was able to see that there really was the jackpot, the hopes that they'd worked for all those years. They uncovered the steps, the first steps. And at that stage, he thought the only thing to do is to quickly cable to my father, tell him to come out, which he did.
Carter waited patiently for Carnarvon's arrival. Together, they breached the door. "Can you see anything?" Carnarvon asked. Then, slowly, the answer. Yes, wonderful things. Wonderful indeed. Carter's vision and Carnarvon's patience had paid off. Beyond treasure, there was the undisturbed body of a long-dead king, the resting place of Tutankhamun, Pharaoh of Egypt. At last, Carter was face to face with his dream. Around Tutankhamun's neck, a magnificent gold collar. Carter recognized it as the vulture goddess Nekhbet, a warning to intruders. There were reports of another warning on a tablet that has since vanished. Death will slay with his wings whoever disturbs the rest of the Pharaoh. There was little time to worry about curses. Ahead lay the enormous task of cataloging the treasure. Carter and Carnarvon were apparently not the first to enter the tomb after it was sealed. There was evidence that someone had rummaged around, then fled. Perhaps ancient tomb robbers frightened by the curse. Carter gathered up the great treasure thieves had abandoned, evidence that Tutankhamun reigned in the glory days of Egypt's past. He ruled from about 1334 to 1325 BC. Tutankhamun was 9 when he became pharaoh, not yet 20 when he died. In those days, Egypt exacted tribute from Asiatic princes and carried on an active trade with the Mediterranean kingdom of Minoa. Word of the discovery of Tutankhamun's treasure spread quickly. Tourists were becoming a problem. Lord Carnarvon returned to Cairo with part of the treasure. He had no way of knowing it, but he would never see England again. Fever, brought on by an infected mosquito bite, ravaged the Earl's body.
When I arrived, there was my father, pulse beating in his throat. You could see he very bloodshot eyes, obviously frightfully feverish and ill. So I say to the nurse, whatever happens, for heaven's sake, call me.
The young Carnarvon went to his own room as his father fought what was to be the last battle of his life.
Sure as fate, about 5 to 2, the good lady is shaking me awake, and she said, "Your father's drawn his last breath. Please come quickly."
Something was wrong with the lights, and young Carnarvon needed a flashlight to find his way to the Earl's bedside. Officially, the cause of Carnarvon's death would be pneumonia. The Egyptian press had another explanation.
Your father disturbed the remains of King Tutankhamun. He took his revenge, and he was responsible for the whole of the lights in Cairo going out at exactly the moment he died.
Lord Carnarvon was only the first of many who would die shortly after visiting the tomb of Tutankhamun. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb was a great event, but the sudden and mysterious death of Lord Carnarvon had cast a pall on the celebration. Carnarvon's grieving son returned to England, only to find new evidence that his father might have unleashed some malevolent force, which cost him his life. Already, the popular press was proclaiming Lord Carnarvon's death to be the revenge of the mummy. His son took refuge behind the walls of Highclere Castle. The memory of that awful night in Cairo would not so easily be shaken.
I had a little fox terrier bitch called Susie. And when I got back, very old fashioned housekeeper, Mrs. McLean, said to me, "I've something to tell you, my lord, a really extraordinary happening." At 5 minutes to 4, and as you know, Cairo time is 2 hours, so we're 2 hours in front of Cairo, she said, Susie sat up on her hind legs. Her mouth was covered in foam. She let out a howl like a wolf and fell back dead.
Something of a panic set in. Collectors rushed to get rid of whatever Egyptian relics they possessed. Howard Carter's assistant, Richard Bethel, died suddenly of a circulatory collapse. Bethel's father, Lord Westbury, committed suicide. The chief Egyptologists at both Paris's Louvre and New York's Metropolitan Museum died shortly after visiting the tomb. American financier Jay Gould took ill and died within days of seeing Tutankhamun's final resting place. To date, 22 deaths have been associated with the curse. Oxford University became the center for an exhaustive study of the relics removed from Tutankhamun's tomb, and for an investigation of the curse many now believed was real. Oxford's Ashmolean Museum is still one of the richest repositories of Egyptian antiquities. Historian Henry Lincoln is a frequent visitor.
It's very easy with our 20th century skeptical, materialistic minds to dismiss the curse of the pharaohs as absolute rubbish. Well, it is just that, absolute rubbish. Death to anyone who enters this tomb is a pretty fierce curse to somebody with a superstitious mind, but it's just a threat, and a pretty ineffectual one at that. And we all know that the curse of the pharaohs was concocted by the popular press because Lord Carnarvon had sold the rights to the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb to the Times, and the other papers wanted something sensational to write about. But to the Egyptians, the curse wasn't rubbish. Tutankhamun's figured largely in the thinking about the curse, and it was Tutankhamun's father-in-law who, in fact, was cursed to wander in all eternity by the priests of Ammon.
The ram's head god, Amun-Ra, was dominant in Egypt before the reign of Akhenaten. Akhenaten introduced the practice of sun worship, symbolized by a new god, Aten. The priests of Amun were stripped of their power. Under this new religion, only the pharaoh could commune directly with Aten. The temples of Amun were defaced, but the priests bided their time. The old religion and the old ways went underground. Egypt's peasants apparently also maintained their loyalty to Amun. Akhenaten died in the 17th year of his reign. his tomb has never been found. Even as the young Tutankhamun was ascending the throne, the priests of Amun moved to regain their power. Akhenaten's name was eradicated from great monuments, his likenesses destroyed.
There was an American artist, Joseph Lyndon Smith, working in the tombs taking copies of the wall paintings at the time that Tutankhamun's tomb was discovered. He felt it would be a good thing to intercede with the gods on behalf of Akhenaten and to lift the curse of Amun-Ra so that the pharaoh was no longer condemned to wander forever in eternity. He was going to do this by putting on a play.
The ruler is born like the atom and will endure for eternity if only we speak his name. We call out the name Akhenaten. Akhenaten, 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 Akhenaten. We call out the name Akhenaten.
At the final dress rehearsal, something unheard of happened. At the moment when Akhenaten's own prayer was being spoken, a colossal hailstorm began. To the Egyptian helpers who were there for the play, it was as if the gods were throwing stones at them. The rehearsal had to be abandoned. The two women who were playing Akhenaten and his mother, both that night had the same dream. Each dreamt that she was standing in a temple dedicated to Amun-Ra, and the statue of the god came to life and struck them. But for each woman there was one small difference in the dream. One of the women was struck across the stomach, and the other across the face. Within 48 hours, the one who had been struck across the body was having a serious abdominal operation, and the one who had been struck across the face had the most virulent case of trachoma ever seen in a European. She almost lost her sight. Everybody associated with that little play, within that period of 48 hours, had been struck down by some minor illness or other. Was that the curse of the priests of Amun, still working after all those thousands of years? And if it wasn't the curse, what was it?
A new chapter to the mystery of the mummy's curse opened in 1976 at the Paris airport. The occasion was an eerie state visit. The mummy of King Ramses was arriving with pomp and circumstance due a chief of state. Something terrible was happening to the mummy, and Egypt wanted France to help. The mummy was taken to the Museum of Man in Paris. In a sealed laboratory, Egyptologists gathered. The Ramesses mummy was among the most perfectly preserved of all those found in the Valley of the Kings. Now it was beginning to deteriorate rapidly. The Egyptians wanted to know if Ramesses could be saved. Tutankhamun's mummy had been ravished by the time of its discovery. Some theorized the priests of Amun deliberately thwarted the embalming procedure. There has been no public announcement to date about what the French experts found when they unwrapped the body of Ramesses. The speculation has been that a dangerous bacteria, perhaps dormant for thousands of years, is now alive and at work on the mummy. Egypt's priests knew something of biology. Perhaps they knew more than modern men imagine. In the tomb of Tutankhamun were many wonderful vessels of gold and alabaster. They were apparently designed to hold precious liquids and rare unguents. If they contained something else, something lethal, the secret died with the last priest of Amun-Ra. 1977 affords millions of Americans the opportunity to see Tutankhamun's treasures. They are on special loan from the Egyptian government and will tour museums in Washington, D.C., Chicago, New Orleans, Los Angeles, Seattle, and New York. 55 works of art from what many consider the greatest archaeological find in history. Time has eroded much of the mystery and awe which gripped discoverers Carter and Carnarvon. The curse is probably rubbish after all. Perhaps the priests of Amun-Ra tasted enough vengeance with the deaths of Lord Carnarvon and some of his close associates. After all, Howard Carter lived out a long and happy life, and he was the first to break the seals on Tutankhamun's tomb. If the priests of Amun sought to obliterate the memory of Akhenaten and his heir Tutankhamun, they failed. Their names have been rediscovered and spoken again and again. To a pharaoh, that was assurance of immortality. Life, symbolized by the Ankh. Earrings, probably worn by Tutankhamun as a young boy. The wooden figures are likenesses of favorite slaves, servants for the pharaoh in the afterlife. Other figures guarded the young king's tomb for the 3,000 years he was forgotten. If we believe the curse, we must believe something else. We must believe that in the end, Tutankhamun triumphed over the priests of Amun.
You're watching LWT.
Even the most level-headed among us can be prone to the occasional superstition. We touch wood for luck. We step into a busy road rather than walk under a ladder. And we get that slightly uneasy feeling on Friday the 13th. All very mild compared to the story we tell tonight of the terrible curse which some believe lay in wait for over 3,000 years. Is it all fevered imagination? Or has it left too many tragic events in its wake to write off as coincidence?
Egypt is home to one of the Earth's most ancient civilizations. Surrounded by thousands of miles of desert sands, its lifeblood is the River Nile. The priceless treasures of King Tutankhamun, filling his tomb and antechambers, are objects of breathtaking beauty. The ancient Egyptians believed Tutankhamun would take them with him to the next world. But when they left these artifacts behind, did they also leave something darker, something which would strike at those who dared to disturb what rightfully belonged to their king?
I see disaster, something evil.
It is 1922, and for more than 30 centuries, no one has set foot into this secret place hidden below the sun-baked, inhospitable desert in the Valley of the Kings. But the sands of time are running out. Thousands of miles away in Hampshire is Highclere Castle, family seat of the 5th Earl of Carnarvon. His meeting with Egyptologist Howard Carter will quite simply make history.
£1,000, and we don't have anything to show for it.
But my lord, the tomb is there, and now we know where we should be concentrating our excavations. My lord, I believe the area will prove most fruitful.
But one cannot go on searching forever. I cannot fund some impossible gamble.
But my lord, think of the prize, and think how you would feel should it be another who makes the discovery which you now most surely have earned. If you would permit Mr. Bethel to show you the search area more precisely. Valley of the Kings. Yes, my lord. The East Valley.
Very well, Carter. You have one more chance.
My grandfather didn't suffer fools gladly. He was interested always in archaeology in this country. I think it was finding bits and pieces of funeral artifacts from Tutankhamun's grandfather that encouraged Carter to advise my grandfather that there were still one place which had never been dug at all.
So in October, November 1922, they agree to have one final go at it. If it doesn't work this time, we'll never look again. The rest is history.
I can only guess, but I imagine my grandfather was very excited when he received the telegram.
From Carter.
At last have made wonderful discovery in Valley. A magnificent tomb with seals intact. Recovered same for your arrival. Congratulations, Howard Carter.
It was the most important find in the history of archaeology, in my view. The most complete pharaonic tomb that had ever been discovered. A bit like the moonshot, you know, in the 1960s. It had that sort of media attention. Carnarvon, in common with a lot of the aristocracy in the 1920s, who'd come out of the First World War, was very interested in spiritualism and in the occult. Upstairs in the East Anglia bedroom, there was said to be sort of seances and table rapping and that sort of stuff.
It was here, during a séance, that Lord Carnarvon was warned that should he go into the tomb, he would be in grave danger. There was another supposed warning to Lord Carnarvon and the rest of the expedition when a famous novelist of the time, Marie Corelli, wrote to the Times in March 1923, claiming that the most dire punishment follows any rash intruder into a sealed tomb.
Finish! But whatever the danger, no one would jib at this adventure. And what an adventure! A challenge to the psychic powers of the ages.
I think his interest in the occult and his interest in Egyptology were two separate things in his life.
And they were obsessed with finding the tomb, so I guess that's why, if there were warnings, they were ignored.
Lord Carnarvon's 20-year-long quest finally ended on February the 17th, 1923, when he and Carter found themselves at the entrance to the burial chamber itself.
This is what we've been working for. If he goes down in that spirit, I give him 6 weeks to live.
Arthur Weigel was an ex-Egyptologist employed by the Daily Mail. So he started producing various stories, amongst which the story that Carnarvon went into the tomb with a broad grin on his face, and Weigel said, if he has that attitude, I doubt whether he'll last 6 weeks.
This is what we've been working for. Yes, yes, yes! Hello? Can you see anything? Wonderful things.
And when they realized the seals weren't broken, the doors of the shrine were sealed with touch seal. That was the moment they knew there was something inside. Carnarvon must have been fantastically excited. Almost blew a fuse.
Oh, my Lord!
When the news of the dig reached the papers, and it was the first peacetime mass media event of the 20th century, someone wrote to the papers and said that when Carter first found the tomb, there was a curse in hieroglyphics. Fabulous stuff.
Death comes on swift wings to he who disturbs the Pharaoh's rest.
There's no doubt there was a curse on nearly all the pharaohs' tombs. As far as this particular tomb was concerned, it would have been the same.
Carter had a pet canary in the Valley of the Kings, and the day the tomb was opened, a cobra got into his house and somehow managed to get into the cage, and the poor canary was eaten.
The cobra on King Tutankhamun's crown was a symbol of power.
The sacred cobra in the tomb would spit fire at people who tried to disturb the rest of the pharaoh. So the cobra eating the canary took on this huge symbolic significance.
After the opening of the burial chamber, Carnarvon suffered a mosquito bite, which at the time seemed nothing more than a minor irritation.
It was said by some that Carnarvon was bitten on the left cheek at the exact spot where there's an indentation on the cheek of the boy King Tut.
Lord Carnarvon thought nothing more of the bite until some days later.
At some stage, my grandfather, he cut himself shaving, cut the mosquito bite, and it became infected, and he got septicemia.
And his temperature starts going up. It's about 102, 104 by this stage. He's getting feverish.
My father heard of my grandfather being very unwell as a soldier in India in the 7th Hussars, and he got permission to travel as fast as possible.
Remember how those Italians ran like rabbits in Piave?
Oh, yes, dear Papa, they did. They did.
We should shell them and shot them like rabbits.
Yes, I'm sure you're right.
And immediately, of course, all hell breaks loose. Various things happen simultaneously.
Papa.
The strangest thing of the lot was the lights going out in Cairo at the time my grandfather died. There was no answer to it, and therefore it's still a mystery, unsolved. My grandfather's Jack Russell, which he'd taken with him on all his other visits, and this time he'd left here at Highclere. At the same time, allowing for time change, let out a howl in the housekeeper's room and died.
Was it King Tutankhamun announcing his revenge? I think the incident with the dog is suggestive, because of course the Egyptians worshipped a god in the form of a dog, Anubis, the jackal god, and Anubis was a god of embalming, and he was also a god that guarded the corpse. There's a magnificent statue of Anubis that was found in the tomb. Isn't it a strange coincidence that a dog dies at the same time as Lord Carnarvon, when there's a dog in the tomb of Tutankhamun keeping guard?
When my grandfather died, they tried to speak to him across the river, as one might say.
During a séance shortly after Lord Carnarvon's death, his son received a warning from him never to go into the tomb of Tutankhamun. Lord Carnarvon was laid to rest here at Beacon Hill, overlooking his beloved Highclere Castle, and his Jack Russell Terrier was buried with him. The 5th Earl's son never went into the tomb, and was reported as saying that he would not accept £1 million to do so. The current Lord Carnarvon has also stayed well away, despite several invitations.
If the evil curse really exists, surely there'd be more victims. After all, Lord Carnarvon wasn't the only person responsible for raiding King Tutankhamun's treasures. In part 2, the curse continues. The discovery of King Tutankhamun's tomb was the most significant find in archaeological history. But there were those who believed that an ancient curse would strike at those responsible for raiding its treasures.
After the death of Lord Carnarvon, worldwide attention focused on the curse. Even the normally restrained Times blamed the ancient Egyptian god of death, Osiris. Meanwhile, it seemed more victims were being claimed.
There was a young man by the name of Richard Bethel. Now, he was a protege of Carnarvon's. He was secretary to the expedition, worked very closely with Carter. He was the son of Lord Westbury. Many of the artefacts from this tomb and others ended up in his house. Now his house was the scene of unexplained bangs, fires were started. A family servant later says that he started the fires because he was freaked out by the atmosphere.
In November 1929, Richard Bethel, apparently a fit and healthy 46-year-old, was relaxing at his London club when he had a sudden seizure.
Bethel himself is found dead in a chair in a club for no apparent reason. Lord Westbury was very upset by his son's death, obviously, and he attributed it to the curse. Lord Westbury was alleged to have gone around muttering, "It is the curse has undone us." He committed suicide, he wasn't killed by a mummy, but something got to him very badly, and we just don't know quite how.
Lord Westbury jumped to his death.
On the way to Lord Westbury's funeral, the hearse runs over a small boy who is also killed. He had nothing to do with the expedition, but he was linked to it by this chain of causality and this chain of tragedy.
If the curse really existed, wouldn't it also have hit Howard Carter? After all, he'd actually discovered the tomb. He in fact lived on for many healthy and happy years, and died a natural death.
Now, of course, one of the main things that the skeptics always say when you bring up the subject of the curse is, oh well, Carter was in charge of the expedition. He lived until 1939 for another 16 years. But I don't think he came off scot-free. He did not have the sort of career of success and professional esteem that you would expect from someone who had made the greatest archaeological discovery of the 20th century. Very few people turned up to his funeral. He was buried in a very small grave. Just because a dog doesn't bite everybody, it doesn't say it doesn't bite somebody. One coincidence, fine. Two coincidences, fine. But what we have in this case is a whole group of different sets of coincidences that all seem to cluster around this one tomb and this one excavation. And then, of course, Lord Carnarvon's family was struck by tragedy as well. His half-brother, Aubrey, died in a fit of insanity. His half-sister was bitten, rather coincidentally, by an insect, and that became infected, and she died. And then there was Lady Carnarvon, Almina, who was a Rothschild's heiress, a rich woman, you would think. But she dies penniless in a bedsitter.
Numerous film and television companies have made dramas and documentaries about King Tutankhamun. Almost all have been riddled with disaster.
If somebody offered me £1 million, I would not go back to Egypt ever again. There was too many things going wrong, and it was really freaky. Everything went wrong.
Trevor Smith trains animals for film productions around the world, including a drama shot this year set around the Tutankhamun story.
Everything went wrong it possibly could do. We had to take some Saker falcons and fly them in the desert. And even on the day, they took 3 days finding the location. And on the day, my man went violently sick, so we couldn't film there. When we eventually did find a location, terrific sandstorms blew up, and we couldn't film. So at the end of the day, it was just a total nightmare.
Even Professor Christopher Frayling, who is skeptical about the curse, suffered a series of bizarre events which he finds difficult to explain away.
When we were filming The Face of Tutankhamun in spring '92, one or two things happened while we were filming that were quite strange. Well, I was standing over the sarcophagus in the tomb and talking all about the curse, actually. And just as I started talking, all the lights went out. The famous international hotel in Cairo. I got into the lift on the 26th floor with the producer, and there was a loud crack followed by swish, 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 and we started shooting down the lift shaft, and some sort of braking system was pushing outwards, and eventually got stuck, lodged in the shaft just below the lower basement. And I realized at that moment we had fallen down the lift shaft. I didn't look up to see if King Tut was there with a hacksaw, and I threw up actually all over the car. I suddenly realized, Christ, I've nearly died.
Peter Graham Scott was the producer of The Curse of King Tutankhamun's Tomb, a film which was supposed to star Ian McShane and was made in 1979 and 80 as part of a lavish co-production to be shown in America.
When we started filming, we had some very simple shots to do of Ian McShane as Carter. We were going to do a shot where he drives up. He was pressing the accelerator instead of the brake. It shot him over the cliff. The car hit the ground and he trapped his leg and it broke pretty badly. But then we had the terrible problem of who is going to play the lead, because Ian was going to be out of action for 4 months. It might well have been something connected with the fact you should not disturb the dead.
Here at St Mark's Graveyard in the Oxfordshire village of Blackburton are buried 2 members from 99 Squadron based at RAF Brize Norton. It was their job to fly Tutankhamun's treasures to an exhibition at the British Museum in London.
In January 1972, I was the loadmaster on a flight from Brize Norton to Cairo to collect the relics of Tutankhamun.
I was the senior technical officer of the trip. The captain held a secret envelope and was told to open it up at a certain time over the Mediterranean.
Pick up Tutankhamun artifacts as detailed below from Cairo Airport. Maintain absolute security at all times.
I was the co-pilot. My memory of the load was a pile of tea chests sitting on the ground outside the aircraft with one solitary Egyptian soldier sitting on top of them with a .303 rifle and a cigarette in his mouth. Didn't seem all that important, up to then anyway.
The value of the cargo we had on board this time was certainly the greatest that I've ever had on board. At 150 to 200 million pounds, you'd have to go a long way to beat it.
There was a few cryptic remarks, of course, about the curse, which was bound to happen, but nobody really kind of took any serious, and nobody certainly was worried about it.
The relics on board included Tutankhamun's 22-carat gold death mask and his coffin.
4 or 5 of us were playing cards, and the reason we played cards, because we were totally bored. That was all it was. And we lost the fact that we were sat on the gold mask. That had no longer any relevance anymore. It was a box for us to play cards on. We all stood up, had enough, and that's when I stood up and kicked the box and said a stupid childish remark.
I've just kicked the most expensive thing in the world.
I do remember kicking the box with my left foot, and of course a couple of years later I fell to the ground. Cursed myself for doing it, and I happened to look down to pick myself up, and I noticed that my left foot was turned round facing me. The next day I found out that I had in actual fact broken 37 bones.
It was the same leg with which Ian had kicked the crate containing the death mask.
The RAF medical people have surveyed me again, and I've got an 80% disability due to the injury alone. The future isn't exactly rosy for me, but at least I'm still around.
Crew member Jim Webb's house was destroyed by fire, and Captain Rick Laurie died a year later. Also on board was Ian Lansdowne's best pal in the RAF, flight engineer Ken Parkinson.
Ken was a very good friend of mine, and he died Friday the 13th of August 1978. Ken and myself were probably the closest friend I've ever had in my life. He was quite a fit man. He played rugby for the Air Force. Ken and Rick were in their early 40s, so naturally we were all surprised to hear 2 comparatively healthy people, both play sport very heavily, die so early. I think people begin to realise there is a possibility that there could be a curse, purely because of the number of people who've been involved in it.
Archaeologists are still searching for other tombs in the Egyptian valleys. Bearing in mind the experiences of those who've come into contact with Tutankhamun's tomb, perhaps it would be wiser to leave the pharaoh's rest undisturbed.
Just for the record, shortly after we began production on this particular program, our researcher was struck down by a sudden and inexplicable illness. It was the first time he'd had to see a doctor in 20 years. All he needed was to take a few pills and keep away from ancient tombs. I think I'll go home now. Good night.
At first, I could see nothing, but presently, as my eyes grew accustomed to the light, details of the room within emerged. Strange animals, statues and gold. Everywhere, the glint of gold. With these words, Howard Carter described the greatest archaeological discovery ever made. Nothing before or since has equaled the splendor and magnificence of the tomb he had uncovered in 1922 in Egypt's Valley of the Kings. These stunning artifacts filled the tomb of Tutankhamun, an obscure pharaoh of the 18th dynasty. Until Howard Carter broke into his resting place, Tutankhamun was known only by one or two minor objects gathering dust in museums. Nothing like this. But from November 1922, his name became a household word. Tutankhamun was Egyptology. He also became the subject of a legend woven around a curse which was said to bring death to anyone who desecrated his tomb. Woe betide any grave robber or archaeologist who disturbed the 3,000-year slumber of the pharaoh Tutankhamun. Howard Carter had long been fascinated by the Valley of the Kings, a royal necropolis hacked out of the barren sides of a sun-blasted valley 600 miles up the River Nile in Upper Egypt, near the small town of Luxor. The valley provided a discreet cemetery for some of the best-known pharaohs of the New Kingdom, which lasted from 1577 to 1085 BC. Seeking security for their mortal remains and the treasures buried with them, the pharaohs were hidden in tombs hewn out of the harsh rock of the valley, rather than under great pyramids of stone. Egypt's famous pyramids had proved rather too obvious an attraction for grave robbers. In 1914, Howard Carter began excavating the valley in association with George Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon. The Earl was an archaeological dilettante who spent much time in the warm climate of Egypt after a car accident left him in frail health. Carter was Carnarvon's field director, a stubborn, short-tempered, self-educated man who had first come to Egypt in 1892. Most archaeologists believed that the Valley of the Kings had yielded up all its secrets, but Carter was convinced that there were some areas which had not been subjected to systematic examination, as they were covered with the debris of previous excavations. Carter's hunch was correct, but he had to wait until the beginning of November 1922 before he uncovered the steps in the rock which were to lead him to Tutankhamun. At the 12th step, he found a sealed doorway. The doorway had been hidden from previous excavators by the remains of workmen's huts erected during the building of the tomb of Ramesses VI. It bore a seal, that of Tutankhamun. Carter carefully filled in the entrance he had uncovered. He then cabled Carnarvon, who arrived in Egypt on the 24th of November. With him was his daughter, Lady Evelyn Herbert. The excavation was reopened, only for Carter to discover that the door at the foot of the steps showed signs of having been opened and then resealed. Had the tomb behind it been plundered? The door was removed, and then 30 foot of rubble left in a passageway to deter robbers. In the rubble, Carter found this exquisite head of the young pharaoh Tutankhamun. Carter now moved down the passage towards a second blocked door. It too bore signs of tomb robbers. He steeled himself for disappointment. With trembling hands, he made a hole in the door large enough to shine a light through. In a frenzy of anticipation, Carnarvon hissed, "Can you see anything?" After an agonizing pause, Carter replied, "Yes, wonderful things." The treasures in the antechamber uncovered by the two men were the start of a stunning process of discovery. As Carter and his team penetrated deeper into the tomb in successive seasons of work, objects of ever greater beauty were brought to the surface. But it was not until the autumn of 1925 that Carter came face to face with Tutankhamun. The body of the pharaoh lay within a series of richly decorated coffins, like a Russian doll wrapped in jewels and gold. Over the head, shoulders, and chest of Tutankhamun's mummified body was a death mask of sheet gold. Bandages were removed, and Tutankhamun's face was seen again for the first time in over 3,000 years. Scientific examination of the mummy established that the pharaoh had died some time between the ages of 18 and 20. Professor Douglas Derry, who examined the body, noted a small scab by Tutankhamun's ear. The cause of his death remains a mystery, but murder cannot be ruled out. Mystery also surrounds the sequence of deaths which raced through those associated with the excavation of the tomb. There was a portent of disaster while Carter opened the tomb. A caged bird in the entrance to his house at Luxor had been eaten by a cobra, the serpent who spits fire on the pharaoh's enemies. News of the incident quickly spread through Luxor. Had the dead king's cobra vented his anger at the betrayal of his master's tomb? The first to die was the 57-year-old Lord Carnarvon. He did not live to gaze on the face of Tutankhamun. On the 6th of March, 1923, Carnarvon was bitten on the face, probably by a mosquito. While shaving in his suite at the Winter Palace Hotel in Luxor, he nicked a small pimple which had formed over the bite. According to one of his colleagues, an unspeakably filthy Egyptian fly then settled on the seeping spot and further infected it. Carnarvon fell ill. He was taken to Cairo, where blood poisoning and pneumonia set in. Lady Carnarvon flew out from England and rushed to his bedside. the world waited to hear the fate of the celebrated archaeological aristocrat. The novelist Marie Corelli issued a warning that the most dire punishment follows any rash intruder into a sealed tomb. Shortly afterwards, on the 5th of April, Carnarvon died. At the moment of Carnarvon's death, in the small hours of the 5th of April, all the lights in Cairo are said to have gone out. It was the first of several sinister events which accompanied his departure from the world and fueled rumors of the curse of Tutankhamun. At Highclere, Carnarvon's home in England, his terrier bitch is said to have set up a terrible howling when he died and then dropped dead herself. Some claim that the suppurating wound on Carnarvon's cheek was in exactly the same place as the scab on the face of the long-dead pharaoh. As he lay dying, Carnarvon might have reflected on the words of Arthur Weigall, an archaeologist long resident in Egypt who also acted as a special correspondent for the Daily Mail newspaper. Weigall had told Carnarvon the tale of an earlier aristocratic archaeologist, an English nobleman who had brought a mummy to England. A series of tragedies followed. The aristocrat's arm was blown off in a shooting accident. His house burned down. His mistress was lost at sea. As Carter's team prepared to enter Tutankhamun's tomb for the first time, Carnarvon was in a jocular mood. Weigall, observing from the sidelines, half-jokingly told the travel writer H.V. Morton, "If he goes down in that spirit, I give him 6 months to live." Half-joking or not, Weigall's prediction came true. Within 6 months of photographing Carter, bringing out the first of the treasures, Carnarvon was dead. Even as he fought for his life, the newspapers were running stories on the curse of the pharaohs. But how mysterious was Carnarvon's death? His constitution had never been strong, and it had been further undermined by the excitement of opening the tomb. Nevertheless, the legend of the lights going out in Cairo when Carnarvon died was confirmed by the British High Commissioner in Egypt, the distinguished soldier Field Marshal Lord Allenby. Allenby apparently asked the engineer in charge of the city's electricity supply for an explanation of the blackout, but none was forthcoming. Arthur Weigall, whose half-joking remarks sparked the legend, was no friend of Carnarvon and Carter, and strongly disapproved of their methods. He had another axe to grind. Carnarvon had given the London Times newspaper exclusive rights to the Tutankhamun story. Weigall, the special correspondent of the Daily Mail, was one of many disgruntled journalists trying to beat the Times embargo. His warning to Carnarvon probably owed as much to frustration as any belief in an ancient curse. Nevertheless, the suspicion that there was more to Carnarvon's death than a septic mosquito bite suited the popular image of ancient Egypt. It satisfied a deep-seated expectation of supernatural evil associated with a strange and distant civilization. One which, by the end of the 19th century, was being explored not just by archaeologists, but a new breed of wealthy tourists. Henceforward, the death of anyone even remotely connected with Carnarvon, Carter, and the discovery of the tomb was hailed as clinching evidence of the long arm of the pharaohs. There seemed no shortage of evidence. In September 1923, Carnarvon's younger brother, Aubrey Herbert, died suddenly after an operation to remove some teeth. An early visitor to the tomb had been Prince Ali Kamel Fahmy Bey. He was murdered by his wife at London's Savoy Hotel. Carnarvon's secretary, Richard Bethell, died unexpectedly of a coronary thrombosis. His father, Lord Westbury, committed suicide by jumping from his 7th-story London apartment. At his funeral, Westbury's hearse ran over and killed a small child. Arthur Mace of New York's Metropolitan Museum had been Carter's right-hand man and present at the opening of Tutankhamun's coffin. His health broke down, and he died in 1929. Arthur Weigall reminded Daily Mail readers that some very strange things have happened in connection with the Luxor excavations. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, declared himself a believer in the curse. Arthur Weigall was well aware of the legends surrounding the gods of ancient Egypt and the power they could exert on an active imagination. In the years before the First World War, Weigall had befriended an American artist, Joe Lyndon Smith, who spent a lifetime painstakingly reproducing the wall paintings in the temples and tombs of the Valley of the Kings. Smith was fascinated by the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten, who had attempted to supplant the cult of the god Ammon-Ra with a new religion based on the worship of the sun. The headquarters of the priests of Ammon-Ra were at the great temple of Karnak, near Luxor. After Akhenaten's death, they took their revenge. He became the ancient Egyptian equivalent of a non-person. Akhenaten was erased from official history, and a curse was placed on him, condemning him to wander forever through the afterlife. In the winter of 1907, Joe Lyndon Smith decided to lift the curse. He enlisted Weigall's help. They wrote a play, which they planned to perform in an eerie natural amphitheatre on which they had stumbled at the head of the Valley of the Queens. Smith's wife, Corinna, was to play the accursed Akhenaten, and Weigall's wife, Hortense, was also given a part. It all seemed great fun, but the play was never staged. On the 23rd of January 1908, Weigall, Smith and their wives gathered in the rock-bound amphitheatre for a rehearsal. As the names of the ancient gods were invoked, the sky was split by a ferocious hailstorm, scattering the native servants. Worse was to follow. That night, Corinna was struck down with a terrible pain behind her eyes. Hortense was taken ill with agonizing stomach cramps. Ammon-Ra visited them in their dreams, striking the afflicted parts of their bodies with his flail. The women were rushed to hospital, where Corinna was diagnosed as having severe trachoma. Hortense underwent an operation which nearly killed her. Had the gods decided to remind these puny mortals of their frailty, or did the near tragedy have more to do with coincidence? Corinna had been complaining of eye trouble for some time, and Hortense was at the beginning of a difficult pregnancy. But the drama of these events would not have been lost on Arthur Weigall. And like any Egyptologist worth his salt, Weigall knew of the elaborate precautions that were taken to safeguard the dead pharaoh in the afterlife. The Ankh was the sign of life itself. Keeping eternal watch at the entrance to the boy king's tomb was the jackal-headed god Anubis, the ancient Egyptian guardian of the dead. One of the sentries in the burial chamber was the goddess Nephthys, with outstretched wings ready to enfold Tutankhamun. The lioness god Sekhmet, and Jemisu, with his savagely hooked beak, stood guard. Protective formulae called on the gods to watch over the dead pharaoh on his long voyage through the afterlife. Hundreds of mannequins, each in Tutankhamun's likeness, stood ready to act as servants when the gods required him to perform a task. The pharaoh was also provided with personal protection. This dagger was found in the linen folds which swaddled the mummy. In the afterlife, Tutankhamun lived on as a conquering warrior. Although he had never drawn a bow in anger, his military deeds in death, once depicted in the tomb, assumed a life of their own. Could the pharaoh smite his enemies from beyond the grave? In 1934, the American Egyptologist Arthur Winlock disagreed. He pointed out that of the 26 people who had been present at the opening of the tomb, 6 had died within 10 years. Of the 22 who had witnessed the opening of Tutankhamun's sarcophagus, only 2 had died. The 10 people who had witnessed the unwrapping of the mummy were still alive. Howard Carter, surely the prime target for the wrath of the pharaoh, died of Hodgkinson's disease in 1939, at the age of 64. Hodgkinson's disease is a rare condition. and it is said that Carter died a lonely and disappointed man. But this 17-year delay perhaps stretches the curse too far. Harry Burton, the man who photographed every detail of the tomb and its contents, died in 1940. Lady Evelyn Herbert, Carnarvon's daughter and one of the first to enter the tomb, survived until 1980. Professor Derry, who took his scalpel to the mummy, lived to the ripe old age of 87. The curse seemed singularly selective. There is no shortage of pseudo-scientific explanations for the curse of the pharaohs. Journalist Philip Vandenberg has suggested that the tombs of the pharaohs were perfect breeding grounds for bacteria, which, over the centuries, could develop unknown and deadly forms, lying in wait for the unwary archaeologist. The ancient Egyptians were expert poisoners. They were familiar with substances which did not need to be swallowed to prove deadly. They could be absorbed through the skin. Wall paintings could be treated with these substances before the chambers in the tomb were sealed and made airtight. Tomb robbers always bored a small hole in the chamber wall before entering to allow fresh air to circulate. So did Howard Carter, but he pronounced Tutankhamun's tomb to be sterile. Another theory, put forward in the late 1940s, suggested that the ancient Egyptians protected their holy places with radioactive rock and smeared the floors with uranium. But the insect which killed Lord Carnarvon was not radioactive. Perhaps the most outlandish claim for the power of the curse concerns one of the worst disasters in maritime history, the sinking of the liner Titanic in 1912. Students of the incident, in which 1,500 passengers and crew lost their lives, know that the liner was lost on her maiden voyage after colliding with an iceberg in the North Atlantic. Those who believe in the curse of the pharaohs remain convinced that tragedy was ensured by the presence on board of an Egyptian mummy. It was the body of a prophetess who had lived during the reign of Tutankhamun's father-in-law, Akhenaten. An ornament found with the mummy bore a spell: "Awake from the dream in which you sleep, and you will triumph over all that is done against you." One thing is certain: Howard Carter's sensational discovery acted as a powerful stimulant to the popular imagination. Hollywood loves a sensation and eagerly embraced the curse of the pharaohs. In 1932, the Universal Studio produced The Mummy, a horror feature in which Boris Karloff starred as a supernatural bandaged menace. It was the first in a long line of mummy movies. When the priceless treasures of the tomb of Tutankhamun traveled abroad, the public who queued to see them were as familiar with the legend of the curse as they were with the matchless beauty of the objects on display. Over 3,000 years after his death, Tutankhamun was big business. The security men closed the doors in the shadow of the Ankh, the symbol of life. Even in the jostling crowds, the contents of the time capsule which carried Tutankhamun through the afterlife have the power to take the viewer on a mental journey through time itself, just as they did Carter and Carnarvon over 70 years earlier. Their eerie beauty has the power to still even the most skeptical observer. In 1972, Tutankhamun's golden mask was crated for shipment to Britain for an exhibition at London's British Museum to mark the 50th anniversary of Carter's discovery. The precious cargo arrived safely and was carefully unwrapped. The tension was almost as palpable as it had been in 1925. In charge of the operation at the Egyptian end was 52-year-old Dr. Gamal Meres, Director General of Antiquities at Cairo Museum. He believed he was living proof that the curse did not exist. But on the day that the shippers arrived to remove the mask of Tutankhamun, Dr. Meres died of a heart attack. The death of Dr. Meres could be seen as another in a long line of sudden and sometimes spectacular exits by people connected to Tutankhamun. For those who believed in the curse of the pharaohs, it provided further evidence of the dangers of tampering with their remains and the relics which accompanied them on their endless journey through the afterlife. Could Carter and Carnarvon really have fallen foul of a curse? Carnarvon was indeed struck down even before the bandages were peeled from the face of the pharaoh. But Carter, who always laughed at the idea, lived on for another 17 years. Was the legend the creature of Arthur Weigall's animosity towards Carnarvon and Carter? Weigall died in Egypt of a fever, a common enough occurrence, but one which earned him the honor of becoming victim number 21 on the Boy King's hit list. Tutankhamun was buried over 3,000 years ago. It may be another 3,000 before we can bury the myth of his curse.
On the banks of the Nile, a boy lies dead, and a man is dying. Two deaths, separated by more than 30 centuries, yet ominously linked. The boy, an Egyptian pharaoh, entombed with a priceless fortune. The man, an English noble, driven to find it. His search triggered the greatest treasure hunt in history and a chain reaction of death. One by one, those who disturbed the pharaoh's tomb perished. To this day, the casualties mount. Science tracks an elusive killer, 3,000 years old. In a Pennsylvania hospital, a young woman is starving to death. The food she needs is oxygen. A simple cough has turned to lung failure. Doctors are stumped by the cause. Unknowingly, the patient's husband holds the first clue to her baffling disease. Its origins lie 6,000 miles away, in a land riddled with age-old mysteries. This is the Valley of Death. Chiseled out of the rock is the world's greatest mausoleum. 1,500 years before Christ, the pharaohs of Egypt were laid to rest here in the Valley of the Kings. It's said you can't take it with you, but they did. Each pharaoh was buried with a king's ransom: ivory, ebony, gold. Each tomb camouflaged by the barren desert. But when archaeologists arrived centuries later, they found only withered bones. Others were here first.
There's a whole village at Kurna, near the Valley of the Kings, which is 1,000% tomb robbers, then and now. And when they can't find something, they forge it and sell you a forgery. Or when they find something, they replicate it and sell the replications. Hey, you know, this is going on since the first pharaoh was interred, these guys started.
For archaeologists, the Valley of the Kings is still the richest pickings on Earth. Yet once they believed it hid no more surprises. Certainly not a lavish tomb for a minor pharaoh. His childhood, like his life, was cut short. At 9, he took the throne, and a wife. 9 years later, he was dead. Little else is known. Leaving just the skeleton of a life, he suffered a fate worse than death. He was forgotten. 3,000 years later, only a handful of men knew the name: Tutankhamun. One was an equally obscure archaeologist named Howard Carter. The other, his backer, George Edward Stanhope Molyneux Herbert, 5th Earl of Carnarvon.
He was very much the Indiana Jones, if you like, of his day. He was into all sorts of exciting adventures, and indeed he drove one of the first racing cars.
And he took part in a rally, and he had a terrible accident, and he was thrown out of the car, and owing to his injuries and subsequent ill health, his doctors told him he could no longer winter in the cold, wet climate of England.
But in those days, even if you had a common cold and you had enough money, your doctor would immediately dispatch you to Egypt to recuperate in the dry heat.
That resulted in ultimately coming together with Carter.
And so began the great quest to find the tomb of King Tut.
A low-born commoner and a wealthy lord were unlikely partners in what experts deemed a shot in the dark.
It was a shot in the dark. This was a time there were no metal detectors, no sophisticated sonar equipment to look into pockets and hollows underneath the soil or the sand. So it was a shot in the dark for everybody but Howard Carter.
Unlike his predecessors, Carter methodically dug up the Valley of the Kings, yard by yard. He found acres of disappointment.
Just before Christmas in 1921, Carnarvon sent for Carter here at Highclere Castle to tell him that he could no longer afford to go on funding what appeared to be a useless project. Carter explained there was very little left to do and begged for one more season, which Carnarvon agreed, but made it absolutely clear that that was the final season.
On the third day, workers uncovered stone steps leading to a hidden doorway, stamped with an ancient seal. It was the mark of royalty. After 5 years of bad news, Carter sent his partner a ray of hope.
Carnarvon was having tea with his daughter Evelyn here in the hall at Highclere Castle when they got a telegram saying, "Think of discovered entrance to magnificent tomb with seal still intact, awaiting your arrival."
While Carnarvon was on his way, something unnerving happened to Carter.
Carter lived on his own, and to keep himself company he'd bought a canary, and the boys had all been very excited by this yellow bird, and they said this wonderful yellow bird will lead us to the tomb. And as he went back to send the telegram, having just found the tomb, his houseboy ran out carrying a bundle of yellow feathers, and he said, "Master, I heard a rustling, and when I went, the cobra was eating the canary. This is an omen. This is unlucky. Master, don't open the tomb. Don't go near it."
And the workers naturally leapt to the cobra, which is on the headdress of every pharaoh, and the pharaoh had come and eaten the symbol of hope, and it was going to be a miserable time, and everybody was going to have, terrible things would happen, and so on.
And Carter said, "Don't be such a damn fool. Just make sure the cobra is no longer in the house."
By dusk on November 26, 1922, workers had excavated a second doorway, bearing the seal of Tutankhamun. It also bore the hallmark of thieves, a patch where the tomb had been broken into. It seemed Howard Carter was 3,000 years too late. Alone in the passage stood Lord Carnarvon, his daughter, Lady Evelyn Herbert, Carter's assistant, and Carter himself. Before him lay the find of his life, or a tomb for his dreams. An eternity passed, while Carter peered into the gloom on the other side. At last, Carnarvon whispered, "Can you see anything?" "Yes," Carter replied. "Wonderful things."
Carnarvon and Lady Evelyn and Becky Callender, they're behind him, you know, going, what is it, you know, for Pete's sake? And finally he says, you know, wonderful things, full of emotion. He can hardly speak. And he looks in and he sees this chamber just cluttered with treasures.
The entire room glittered, and all that glittered was gold. Carter was stunned.
We'd never dreamed of anything like this. A whole museum full of objects, some the like of which we had never seen. The thing was overwhelming.
There's never been a pharaoh found in any way almost intact. People have been searching for them. Dozens and dozens of great pharaohs, the richest people, the most powerful people of all of history, in perfect condition. We're talking about things that you look at now, you cannot believe that these are the thousands of years old that they are. It's awesome. I can't think of another dig that's as good as this. Can't think of it.
Carter later said they looked around, then left. But evidence says they did more that night than just look.
Carter and Carnarvon were not allowed by their franchise to enter the tomb without an Egyptian Organization of Antiquities official present. And they never said they entered it. They waited. They looked in. They saw wonderful things. You know, they went bananas. And they sealed up the hole. They waited 3 days for the guy to get down from Cairo to go with them. Would you have done that after 10 years of extraordinary struggle? Would I have done that? No, I would not have done that. And they did what you and I would have done. They went in. And they spent all night in there.
The smallest, Lady Evelyn, led the way inside. 3 men, 1 woman, and somewhere, a dead boy.
It's dark. You're in there, the first person in 1,000 years to be inside the tomb of a person who had died. There must have been a little of the old haunting, the hauntedness that comes with that. Then there's fear, because they were in there illegally. They were like the thieves of ancient times. The place was a shambles because the thieves, and there were 2 sets of thieves, had gone in there, and there is some indication that at least one of the 2 bands of thieves was caught. The chances are if they were caught in the act, head off, and that's it.
The discoverers began to count their blessings. They would eventually total 5,000. The tomb of Tutankhamun was the greatest find in history. Overnight, Carnarvon, Carter, and Tut became celebrities.
They felt, I mean, just total triumph, victory. And they'd been laughed at, they'd been mocked. It'd been kind of a whispering campaign, they've lost their marbles, you know. And here they have it.
Tut's tomb also made history as the first dig ever preserved on the newfangled medium of motion pictures. This piece of celluloid preserved the discoverers. Carter, as he was photographed by Carnarvon. Howard Carter was a star.
The personal reward
I believe, for an archaeologist, which everyone can see, is the fame. After a major discovery, of course, the public and the newspaper and the media and the TV and everyone will run after you. Then at the beginning, archaeologists can like that. But at the end, fame is not fun. I think fame is a curse.
Drunk on success, the discoverers made a fateful mistake. Tut's tomb would become one of the biggest stories in history. But to recoup his expenses, Lord Carnarvon sold exclusive rights to one newspaper.
And that was the London Times. That was the gentleman's paper, you know. This was the nobility's paper. And he signed a deal with them which caused him unending grief. Stupid thing for him to do, but anyway, he did it.
Carter would live to regret the mistake. Carnarvon would not. The man who bankrolled the search for King Tut first came to Egypt for his health. That decision would prove fatal. One morning in the spring of 1923, Lord Carnarvon cut himself, exactly where a mosquito bit him days before. The wound didn't heal. Days later, on a trip to Cairo, Carnarvon was racked by fever.
I'm sorry to tell you that C is seriously ill.
His secretary, Richard Beathouse, sent Howard Carter bad news. The mosquito bite was infected.
That poisoned bite has spread all over him. And he's got blood poisoning.
As fever turned to chills, Beathouse' concern turned to fear. He notified Carnarvon's wife in England, who at once summoned a specialist and flew to Cairo. Carnarvon was beyond help.
At the moment that he died, all the lights in Cairo went out. And at the time, all the utilities in Cairo were run by the British Army, and they could find no way of turning them back on, and could find no reason for them to have gone off. And 20 minutes later, they all came on again.
At that very moment, something else unexplainable happened, more than 2,000 miles away in England.
Carnarvon's little fox terrier, Susie, was asleep in her basket in the housekeeper's room at Highclere Castle, and at the very second that he died, Susie sat up in her basket, howled and dropped down dead.
Lady Evelyn buried her father on a hill overlooking his beloved Highclere. There, she also laid to rest her Egyptian adventure.
When Carnarvon died, it was a tremendous shock to my mother, and it all happened so very quickly. She was only just 21, and she adored her father, and I don't think she ever completely recovered, because she never went back to Egypt after his death.
Like the king whose slumber he disturbed, the English noble would not rest in peace. Carnarvon's body was barely cold when the world's press named the culprit. Inscribed within the tomb, wrote one reporter, was a curse that warned, "I will kill all those who cross this threshold." Another paper reported a curse that was eerily accurate. They who enter this sacred tomb shall swift be visited by wings of death. For Carnarvon, death indeed came on wings. Howard Carter shrugged off the curse and went back to work, but he couldn't shake the loss. Carnarvon had shielded the prickly archaeologist from a curious world. As the world crowded in, tragedy would again strike Carter. Fascinated by Tut's treasure and undaunted by his curse, a plague of tourists descended on his tomb. One of the few allowed inside was the railroad tycoon George J. Gould, guided by Carter himself. For his private tour, Gould paid a heavy price. That night, he came down with fever. The next day, he died. A British industrialist suffered the same fate. It seemed the curse of Tutankhamun had struck again. It wasn't the last time an intruder would die of unnatural causes.
It was going to be like our honeymoon, because we never took one when we got married.
Among the visitors to Tut's tomb in 1995 were Gary Munson and his wife Cheryl. For Cheryl, a student of art history, it was the trip of a lifetime.
Well, everybody we knew we were going there. As soon as she talked to somebody, the first thing she was talking about was going over there.
The sights so amazed her, seeing them wasn't enough.
We were going down the stairs into the tombs and looking at how the dark blues and the reds that were painted on there. She slowly leans over and she's looking real close at it, and she starts slowly bringing her hand up to it until she finally started touching and rubbed some of the paint. And then the guide saw her, yell at her for touching it. She turns around and says, "My teacher said if you ever get over here, you have to touch the paint no matter what they say, because you're never going to get a chance to do it again."
When the Munsons returned to Pennsylvania, Cheryl's trouble began.
Maybe 3 weeks after we got back, she started getting a little slight cough now and then. And it just progressively got worse and worse till finally she's coughing most of the time.
When Gary urged Cheryl to see a doctor, she refused. She'd seen her fill during a weary battle with Hodgkin's disease.
She had chemotherapy, radiation treatment, just about everything you go through with a cancer treatment. And she did not want to go back to doctors after that. Finally, she had to go.
I first met Mrs. Munson when she was already a patient in the intensive care unit. And at that time, she was in critical condition. She started out with some weight loss, weakness, some shortness of breath. And by the time she was admitted to the hospital for a workup, there were already major signs of disease that were present. A definite involvement of both lung fields, and this had progressed.
They suspected it might have been Hodgkin's acting up again, because the symptoms were something like that. But after a day or two, they ruled that out. They started thinking something was the matter with their lungs, but they never really got the chance to find out, because it moved along too quick. So they decided they were going to have to do a lung biopsy.
Both from her lung secretions, as well as subsequently from her lung itself, we were able to identify a fungus, Aspergillus niger, which is a mold, and this was very likely the precipitating event of her illness.
Microscopic spores from the fungus are easily inhaled. Healthy bodies resist them, but Cheryl's immune system was crippled from her battle with Hodgkin's. The spores invaded cell after defenseless cell, destroying as they went. Cheryl Munson was starving for oxygen. "10 days after she entered the hospital, her lungs gave out. She was 38 years old. The case wasn't quite closed. The mystery was the scene of the crime. Where did Cheryl Munson rendezvous with her killer? For ancient Egyptians, eternal life required a well-preserved corpse. The result was a funeral to die for. The body needed not only preserving, but protecting. To ward off evil, no fewer than 143 amulets and charms were wrapped inside the burial shroud of Tutankhamun. And these were just the first line of defense.
I will take you now to visit one tomb that contained the first curse ever existed. This is the tomb of Hesse. It's dated back to more than 4,000 years, and it has at the entrance of the tomb a very interesting curse inscription.
From pharaohs to peasants, the Egyptians guarded their graves with spells and curses.
As for any person who will enter this tomb,
David Silverman is professor of Egyptology at the University of Pennsylvania. He's translated dozens of ancient curses, including the 4,000-year-old curse of Hesse.
The curse is a prohibition against anyone who comes into the tomb having eaten a certain kind of food that was forbidden, like pork or fish.
Something unclean, or something unclean connected with his soul.
Or having committed an act of sexual impurity, in this case, adultery.
And after he made love to all women.
And if it so happened, then the individual might be punished in this life or in the afterlife.
Therefore will be judged in front of the great God.
For Professor Silverman, not every curse is academic.
I received a call from a physician, and he told me this very interesting and very unfortunate story about a woman who had gone with her husband to Egypt and had gone into the tomb of King Tut, and it turned out that she had picked up a fungus.
At that time, we were aware that we had Aspergillus niger isolated from the specimens that we took from Mrs. Munson, and we were also aware of her trip.
She had to pick up something over there.
So what we had to find out was whether these molds were also present in the tombs that she visited.
It's the only place it could have come from.
And so we called the Egyptology department at the University of Pennsylvania.
So they were wondering if this had anything to do with the curse.
It was very important for us also to know whether this had ever been described before.
It had. In 1923, 2 men died suddenly after visiting Tut's tomb. What doctors chalked up to fever was reported as Tut's curse. Two more sudden deaths followed. Becky Callender, who helped Carter break into the tomb, and Arthur Mace, who helped remove its contents. The true killer lurks on the very walls of the tomb. To Howard Carter, it looked like chipped paint, till he looked closer.
The walls are covered with small brown fungus growths, the original germs of which were probably introduced either with the plaster or the paint, and were nourished by the enclosed humidity from the plaster after the chamber had been sealed up.
The fungus is Aspergillus niger. In the warm, damp tomb, it thrived, the only living thing for 3,000 years. When Cheryl Munson arrived with a crippled immune system, she was a prime host for the fungus.
I think by connecting our case, which is a modern-day case, to the visit and the tombs itself, we were able to have a direct link to what might have happened to the archaeologist who had visited some time ago. And I am rather confident that in at least some of these cases, that Aspergillus could have easily played a role.
Science was ready to close the file on Cheryl Munson, but not on Tut's curse. November 11th, 1925. In Egypt's Valley of the Kings, a boy who died more than 1,000 years before Christ is about to be resurrected. Tutankhamun lies within 3 coffins, one inside the other. The innermost, nearly 300 pounds of solid gold. Inside the gold coffin lies an object even more breathtaking, the mummy itself, adorned with a stunning death mask of the boy king. As a human likeness, only a handful of the greatest statues can hold a candle to its brilliance.
That gold mask alone is one of the single most beautiful objects in all of mankind's history, not just Egyptian.
The corpse of Tutankhamun lay beneath 13 layers of linen. As Howard Carter peeled them away, he discovered the precious amulets hidden inside to ward off evil. Over the centuries, the resins and oils used to mummify the body had turned to glue. To retrieve the amulets, Carter performed a radical operation. He hacked up the corpse. The outcome of this autopsy was fatal. Within 14 days, 2 of the participants suddenly died. By 1927, 6 men were dead of a single apparent cause, the mummy's curse.
This is really such a well-preserved mask. You can see these copper eyelashes around the stone eyes here.
Dr. Rosalie David is the queen of mummies. As curator of Egyptology for England's Manchester University Museum, she's autopsied 35 mummies, more than anyone else. She also pioneered a way to do it without destroying them.
So we have a mummy of an old lady here using x-rays and using endoscopes. We go in through existing bodily holes and we take tissue samples, and we can use these for DNA identification. And also, we hope in the future it may be possible to detect viral and bacterial DNA in the mummies. So this is a much better method of working.
The endoscope lets Dr. David examine the corpse without even unwrapping it, in complete safety.
Working with a mummy can be hazardous, both for the operator and for the mummy, because the operator could breathe in spores from the mummy dust, and in reverse, the operator could deposit bacteria or moisture onto the surface of the mummy, thus causing decomposition.
Though dead for thousands of years, a mummy is alive with bacteria, some harmless, some lethal.
We wear protective clothing when we work with the mummies, and this protects us against the fungal spores.
Rosalie David knows the true fate of those who disturbed the bones of Tutankhamun. Their crude autopsy unleashed an invisible killer.
In the old days, the operators didn't wear protective clothing at all. They simply wore their everyday clothes, and so there could be an interchange of damage between the operator and the mummy.
A mummy's dust. Such was the peril in Tut's coffin. Yet 70 years ago, the world remained spellbound by a hex, warning of death on wings. By 1929, 13 people with links to Tut's tomb were dead, and those with no link were spooked. Anonymous packages began arriving at the British Museum. They held Egyptian artifacts from collectors who sought to purge their closets and ease their minds.
And this has gone on to modern times. A few years ago, a couple came in with an Egyptian object, or what they claimed was an Egyptian object, and they were concerned that it might have a curse associated with it. And they asked me to examine it. In fact, it didn't have a curse. It probably wasn't an ancient Egyptian object at all. And several months later, I had a call from the police asking me to be an expert witness in a case wherein the husband had killed his wife, and it was this couple, and he had claimed that he had killed his wife because of the curse that was on this object.
The first victim of Tut's curse, the wealthy Lord Carnarvon, bequeathed to his heirs a case of jitters.
After my great-grandfather's death, obviously my grandfather inherited Highclere, and my grandfather was very concerned about the curse of King Tut, and actually wouldn't allow the name Tutankhamun to be spoken in the castle. Highclere Castle on a cold, wintry, windy night can be pretty frightening, and if you add the supposed curse of the pharaohs to that, you can get pretty spooked. Well, after my grandfather died, we had to do an inventory of the castle, and of course, being such a huge place, that did take rather a lot of time, and at last it was completed, and as a family we were all gathered here in the castle, along with Robert Taylor, my grandfather's butler, who was one of the great British butlers, and my father turned to Robert Taylor and said, "Well, thank goodness that's all over with now, Robert." And Robert Taylor turned to my father and said, "Well, my lord, it's everything apart from the Egyptian stuff." As you can imagine, all of us as a family were absolutely amazed by this comment. And we said, "Well, what Egyptian stuff, Robert?" And he said, "Well, if you'll follow me," he said, "I'll lead you to the secret cabinets."
The Egyptian government kept careful track of every object found in Tut's tomb. Yet 17 small artifacts were somehow smuggled out. Carter and Carnarvon found the lure of treasure irresistible. few in their place would not.
Ha! When I dug in Morgantina in Sicily, this Greek town, did I put a memento into my pocket? Yes, I did. A couple of silver coins, no big deal, but I guess everybody does. Carter did, Carnarvon did.
The man who found Tut's tomb was among the few to escape its curse. Almost. When he made the greatest find in archaeology, Howard Carter had the world at his feet. Then he tripped.
He had the environment. He had dust storms. His good friend Carnarvon is dead. He is under huge pressure from the Egyptians. He's under enormous pressure from the press that didn't get the story. He has a tiny little space to work in. He's going crazy. His temper is frayed. He's a very volcanically temperamental guy. Anyway, Howard Carter just gets to the point where he can't take it any longer. And he cracked.
Obsessed with access to what he felt was his tomb, Carter one day locked everyone out, including the Egyptians.
That's really a big mistake. Because if a foreigner is working in a country, he has to know that he's a guest. And if you are a guest, you have to respect the people that you're working with.
And when he did this rash act of putting these enormous iron gates and locking it, it was the English takeover of something that the people of Egypt owned, which was true. And they went crazy, and they threw him out.
After a year's exile, Carter was allowed back, at a terrible price. He had to surrender his claim to Tut's treasure. Fate spared him to live day after day with the treasure he found, but could never possess. Perhaps the ultimate curse. Carter spent the next decade in the Valley of the Kings, cataloging Tut's 5,000 wonderful things. On March 2nd, 1939, at 65, he died of normal causes. Like the tomb of Tutankhamun, Carter's grave is guarded by wings. Before he died, Carter made amends with Tut. The pharaoh's bones were put back together, and he was laid to rest in his tomb. He wouldn't rest in peace. In a chain reaction of tragedy, his curse claimed 5 more victims. First, Lady Carnarvon died suddenly of an insect bite, just like her husband. Then Richard Bethel, Lord Carnarvon's secretary, died mysteriously in his sleep. 3 months later, Bethel's father, Lord Westbury, leapt from a 7th-floor window to his death. He left a note blaming his son's death on the curse of King Tut. On the way to the cemetery, Lord Westbury's hearse struck an 8-year-old boy. At the exact moment the boy died, so did an employee of the British Museum, whose field was Egyptology. For 3 decades, the curse lay dormant, till the last time Tut's slumber was disturbed. Near the banks of the Nile, the pharaoh Tutankhamun was buried, with 5,000 priceless belongings. His royal treasures were meant to accompany him on his journey to the afterlife. Instead, they took a detour. In the 1970s, Egypt bowed to popular demand and sent scores of Tut's relics on a world tour. Egypt's director of antiquities dreamed he would die if the treasures left the country. 3 months later, he was killed in an auto accident, the 25th victim of Tut's curse. The same day Tut's mask was packed for London, an Egyptian official who scoffed at the curse died of a heart attack. Among the sightseers when the treasure reached London was the first person to enter Tut's tomb, Lady Evelyn Herbert.
My mother had never seen the final sarcophagus because they hadn't reached that particular chamber before her father died. At the time of the exhibition in London, the television and radio used to ring up my mother and say, tell us about the curse. And she'd laugh and say, well, I'm alive and kicking at 70, and I don't believe in it. I think it was a very exciting time for her, very traumatic, possibly stressful, because she was seeing the things that she realised her father had never seen after all his years of effort. And coming out of the museum, probably on her 5th visit, she had a major stroke and was paralysed from then on. But of course it could easily have been a coincidence brought on by stress and trauma.
Coincidence has managed to account for most of the victims of Tut's curse. To explain the rest, science went back for a closer look.
In any of the inscriptions that occur in the tomb, there are none that can be considered a curse. So what we would consider, or as an Egyptologist I would consider, an ancient Egyptian curse does not occur in the tomb of King Tut.
The so-called curse was unwittingly spawned by its first victim. When Lord Carnarvon gave sole coverage of Tut's tomb to the London Times, rival papers were outraged. At Carnarvon's death, they got even by printing rumors of a curse. Even the bizarre goings-on when Carnarvon died can be explained.
All the lights went out in Cairo when Carnarvon died. The lights always go out in Cairo at all times. All of this stuff took off. It was just like anything today. An outrageous series of half-truths and some truth and some lies, some made up. It was great. Very potent stuff. Still is.
When Tut's tomb was visited by Carnarvon's no-nonsense granddaughter, even she thought twice.
I'd been warned following my stroke that I had a bad heart, and I saw there were steps down and a hill down. Even young people were coming up that hill and those steps, panting, and I felt that discretion was a better part of valour, and I didn't want another headline, King Tut kills again.
The son of Lord Carnarvon talked about how he doesn't really believe in the curse, but he said there really isn't any way to explain a lot of what went on. And that has kept the curse alive.
Accidents can happen. Like it happened with me many times, accidents like this. I was excavating in my early days in a site in the Delta. The first year, in the same day that I put the artifacts inside the museum, someone called me inside the museum and said, your uncle died. The next year, in the same day, they said, your aunt died. And the third year, my cousin died. Anyone who will see that, he will talk about the curse. And even, you know, when I discovered a sealed tomb with beautiful 4 statues, and those statues are incredible, incredible. And I was the first one to see them. Next day, the earthquake happened in Cairo. Third day, I had a heart attack. Reporters took it as a fact, and they talked about the curse.
No matter how you try to kill it, it's like a phoenix. It resurfaces over and over again. But then again, no matter how much we hear that there isn't a Loch Ness Monster or that there aren't any UFOs through logical means, we still believe in them, don't we?
It's marvelous human nature. We need this sort of stuff. We love it. Even if I know it's all made up, I love it. I love the Tut curse.
As curator of the Tutankhamun exhibit during its American tour, Thomas Hoving one night found himself face to face with the cursed pharaoh.
And I reached up and I grabbed that thing in my hands and I lifted it off the pedestal. And I was looking right, 6 inches right in those gorgeous, beautiful eyes. And I turned around, right, left, there's nobody around, and I gave him a big fat kiss right in the lips. And I'll tell you something, that curse went away from me. I was clean. I'm fine.
Tut's treasure now resides in the Cairo Museum, where millions have gazed on it in awe. The museum is also the humble tomb for dynasties of pharaohs, but Tutankhamun still rests in the Valley of the Kings. Once the most obscure pharaoh, he's now the most famous. Ancient Egyptians went to their graves with an undying belief. Say my name, and I shall live. Tutankhamun, a household name, now has what he wanted most: immortality. He owes it to the very men who disturbed his tomb. They also left him the kind of protection other pharaohs would kill for. A curse that would make even skeptics tread lightly.
For 3,000 years, the treasures of Tutankhamun lay entombed beneath Egypt's desert sands. Until archaeologists disturbed the pharaoh's rest and unleashed a deadly curse. It's a controversial issue that scientists dismiss out of hand. Yet the threat of an ancient curse has enthralled the public for nearly 100 years. When an Egyptian king died suddenly 3,000 years ago, it marked the start of an ancient murder mystery that baffles scientists to this day. Far more chilling than the death of this young pharaoh is the mystery of his curse, said to have caused a sinister series of deaths that began with the opening of his tomb in 1922. This is the story of Tutankhamun. It's set against the backdrop of Egypt. This country of awe-inspiring natural beauty is more than twice the size of Texas. Egypt sits on the Mediterranean Sea at the northeast corner of Africa, between Libya, Israel, and the Sudan. It's a land steeped in mysticism, which shrouds the most magnificent monuments in the world. Architecture of colossal proportions bears silent witness to a glorious past. Thousands of years ago, Egypt was home to the ancient Egyptians, at that time the most advanced civilization on Earth. They practiced science, had developed written language, and had a complex religion. And it's here in Egypt that a fantastic detective story played out, bringing triumph and victory, as well as terror and tragedy. When archaeologists discovered the tomb of Tutankhamun in Egypt's desert hills, they found treasures that defied imagination. But did they also unearth more than they'd bargained for? The story starts half a world away from the wonders of Egypt, in England. This is Highclere Castle, 60 miles west of London. It is home to the 8th Lord Carnarvon, godson of the Queen. His great-grandfather, George Herbert, was the 5th Earl of Carnarvon. It was his fascination with ancient Egypt that led to the discovery of Tutankhamun.
He was one of the last great sort of Edwardian gentleman adventurers. He was a terrific character with a wide range of interests in horse racing, photography, fast cars, and it was in fact because of hitting a tree with a fast sports car, he damaged his lungs. He was advised by doctors to winter in climates with dry air.
So in 1903, George Herbert, Lord Carnarvon, headed to Egypt, where he could indulge his passion for photography. At the turn of the century, Egypt was a land shrouded in mystery. Immense pyramids that defied comprehension in the West gave rise to the belief that the Egyptians had supernatural powers. Egypt presented Lord Carnarvon with an intoxicating combination of ancient monuments and mysticism. And it was in Egypt that Lord Carnarvon met the dedicated archaeologist, Howard Carter. Carter was a maverick with great determination. His ambition was to find the tomb of an ancient Egyptian king, known as a pharaoh. To do that, he would have to organize an excavation here in the Valley of the Kings, where the pharaohs of ancient Egypt were buried 3,500 years ago. By the time Western archaeologists arrived more than 100 years ago, grave robbers had already plundered the tombs. But Carter was convinced that one royal tomb had survived undisturbed. Little did he know how magnificent it would be. But his quest required money. So he came to Highclere and Lord Carnarvon for help.
It was a partnership. It was the pair of them. And it wasn't just the case that my great-grandfather was funding the thing, because he took an enormous interest in everything and was excited about every find. So the two were fascinated by the fact that there could be an intact tomb somewhere.
It would prove to be a winning combination: the aristocratic earl and the passionate archaeologist. Their find would transport the world thousands of years back in time, unearthing fantastic treasures, but perhaps disturbing the forces of evil. It was a find that took a long time in coming.
Many of the great discoveries and achievements in the world are because people really believe in something, even if it appears a hopeless quest to start with, but they kept at it.
Their first real lead came in 1907 when a minor discovery was made in the Valley of the Kings. Excavators were working near an insignificant tomb known as KV-54. A worker clearing out the pit of the tomb unearthed a vital clue: artifacts bearing the name of Tutankhamun. Perhaps these were the remains of the pharaoh's burial feast that would have taken place near his tomb. It would be 12 years before they found out.
It must have had its frustrations and difficulties. Like I know that they were sort of arguing about the cost of things and how long it was taking.
Egyptian bureaucracy and the First World War meant the excavation was slow and unrewarding. As the 20s dawned, they found they had nothing but the artifacts unearthed more than a decade earlier. In 1921, Lord Carnarvon decided to quit. Howard Carter returned to Highclere to convince him otherwise.
My great-grandfather, being a bit of a gambling man, said, "Oh God, then I will fund you for another year and we'll keep on going for one more year."
His instincts were to prove correct. On November 1st, 1922, a boy working on Carter's excavation uncovered a step. It was the first significant find in more than 10 years. Carter could only dream of where it might lead. By the following day, they had cleared a whole staircase, disappearing deep below ground. As Carter descended into the gloom, he could only guess at what lay before him. Perhaps he was standing at the entrance to the only undisturbed tomb of a pharaoh. At the bottom of the steps stood this wall imprinted with some faint and illegible seals. Could the wall be concealing the treasures he sought? Carter sent a telegram to Carnarvon with the news, advising him to hurry to Egypt. Before leaving, Carnarvon held a séance in one of the bedrooms at Highclere. Here, a clairvoyant warned him that danger lurked inside the tomb. But the Earl ignored the ominous prediction and returned to Egypt. Soon after his arrival, excavators broke down the first wall and cleared the passageway beyond. To their frustration, it led to another wall. But then their spirit soared. It was stamped with the seal of Tutankhamun. Carter and Carnarvon could only dare hope that behind this wall were the treasures they had sought for so many years. In the eerie silence, Howard Carter struck the first blow, perhaps sealing the fate of more than 30 people who would die before their time. Inside the tomb, a sinister creaking could be heard. When Carter inserted a candle to check for foul gases, the flame flickered violently as stale air trapped for thousands of years escaped. What lay behind the wall would soon be revealed. When Howard Carter and Lord Carnarvon broke into Tutankhamun's tomb, they shed light on a treasure trove that had lain in darkness for more than 3,000 years. Thoughts of a curse lay far from their minds. For them, it was a moment they would cherish forever.
The seal on the door hadn't been broken. They were the first people who were seeing it. That would have been like the 6 numbers of the lottery coming up. I mean, can you imagine after all those years? I mean, it must have been wild.
What they had discovered was the first part of the tomb, the antechamber. It held everything a pharaoh might need in the afterlife. Photographs taken at the time show a priceless hoard of staggering proportions. The sounds they heard from inside the tomb were the sacred objects adjusting as fresh air rushed in, injecting this moribund world with a new lease of life. Meanwhile, outside the tomb, something sinister had taken place. Just as Carter was breaking down the wall, a snake stole into his house and killed his pet bird. It was a chilling omen. In ancient Egypt, a pharaoh was given a headdress adorned with a snake, which defended its master by spitting in his enemy's eye. Had the curse of Tutankhamun claimed its first victim? The incident fueled press speculation that the archaeologists had discovered something sinister in the tomb, but had kept it secret. Newspaper reports claimed that a tablet had been found inscribed with a deadly curse. Supposedly, it read, "Death will slay with his wings whoever disturbs the peace of the pharaoh." The tablet was never found. The press suggested that the ancient Egyptians had harnessed some mystical force to guard the tomb and its treasures. Carter and Carnarvon had breached the antechamber of Tutankhamun's tomb, but the body of the pharaoh was nowhere to be seen. There had to be another room. Before they could find out what lay beyond, they had to clear the antechamber of treasures that had lain in darkness for more than 3,000 years. It was the biggest mass media event of the 1920s. Out in the sunlight, the pharaoh's secret riches were paraded for all to see. Carter conducted the operation with meticulous care. For him, it was a dream come true. Lord Carnarvon recorded it for his album. With the antechamber empty, they could start the hunt for the real prize, the body of Tutankhamun. They knew he must be in the tomb, but where? Beneath a couch, they found a small hole, the entrance to another room. Could this be where the pharaoh lay? It turned out to be a simple storeroom. Undaunted, they turned their attention to an adjacent wall, symbolically guarded by 2 black and gold sentinels. Perhaps this concealed the body of a pharaoh who had died mysteriously more than 3,000 years before. Once again, Carnarvon was by Carter's side when the work began. This time, their efforts were rewarded with the glint of gold. As the weeks progressed, the truth became clear. At last, they had found the burial chamber, and next to it was the treasury. Inside lay even more priceless treasures, a hint that they must now be close to the pharaoh's mummy. Finally, they began opening the shrines in search of the mummy itself. 3 golden caskets, one inside the other, contained 3 coffins. The last was 300 pounds of solid gold. When they opened this final coffin, the mummy of Tutankhamun was revealed, protected by a fabulous golden mask. But by the time Carter came face to face with the pharaoh, he was on his own, and Lord Carnarvon was dead. 10 days after the opening of the tomb, a mosquito had bitten Carnarvon on the face. No one thought anything of it. But within a few days, his health had deteriorated. The bite had become infected. Carnarvon returned to Cairo. By now, he had a raging temperature and was suffering from blood poisoning. In the early evening of April 5th, 1923, Lord Carnarvon staggered back to his hotel. 7 hours later, he was dead. But the strange happenings didn't stop there. The moment Carnarvon died, all the lights went out in Cairo. And simultaneously, back in England, Carnarvon's pet terrier howled and dropped dead. Two years later, when Howard Carter finally examined Tutankhamun's mummy, he found a scar on its cheek in exactly the same place as Lord Carnarvon's mosquito bite. As the alleged curse had predicted, death had indeed come on wings. The apparent curse of Tutankhamun seemed to have been at work. And Lord Carnarvon was not the only person to meet an untimely end. 22 people directly related to the dig died prematurely. Could they all have been victims of the curse, or was it mere coincidence? Arthur Mace, a leading member of the expedition, was in a coma after working on the treasures, and within days, he died of pneumonia. A radiologist who led the autopsy of the mummy collapsed from exhaustion and died of an unknown cause. Carter's colleague, Arthur Callender, had taken part in opening the grave. He died of pneumonia. As did American businessman George J. Gould. He was stricken by a high fever 24 hours after entering the tomb. That evening, he was dead. Back in England, the list continued. Lord Carnarvon's wife, Countess Almina, also died from an insect bite. And his half-brother, Aubrey Herbert, died from blood poisoning. Richard Bethel was Lord Carnarvon's secretary. He passed away mysteriously at his London club. Then Bethel's father, Lord Westbury, wrote a suicide note blaming the curse and jumped from the roof of his London home to his death. The story of Tutankhamun's curse has enthralled the world for many years. But now, experts believe that something other than a mummy's revenge is to blame.
Spawned from the depths of doom comes the most fearful monster of the ages, to strike with paralyzing terror the despoilers of ancient tombs.
When Howard Carter and Lord Carnarvon opened the tomb of Tutankhamun in 1922, many believed they had disturbed a pharaoh's rest and would fall victim to an ancient curse.
Eternal punishment for anyone who opens this casket.
It was an idea already embedded in the public's imagination. Today in London, at the Royal College of Art, Sir Christopher Frayling traces the origins of the curse back to journalists who were captivated by the idea of the revenge of King Tut.
Watching archaeology is like watching paint dry. You know, the movie footage gives you an idea of what it must have been like, and nothing happens at all. Just a few Edwardian gentlemen in three-piece tweed suits and pith helmets coming out, staggering out, carrying bits of couches and bits of chariot and all that. So you've got frustrated journalists with nothing left to write about, and a huge public appetite created for stories about King Tut.
Within weeks of opening the tomb, Lord Carnarvon dies.
And then the press went mad, because here was the story they'd been waiting for. Here was the angle that they'd been waiting to construct. Enter the curse of King Tut, that because he'd opened the tomb, he was going to get it, you know. And then from then on, whenever anybody remotely connected with the dig caught a cold, the papers would say, "Oh, I told you so."
When journalists found out that Carnarvon had been forewarned of his fate, their fascination with the mummy's curse reached fever pitch.
The mummy. Is it dead or alive?
Hollywood really cements this by producing The Mummy.
You'll feel the awful, creeping, crawling terror that stands your hair on end.
It's wonderful. It really is a brilliant piece of movie making. And in that you've got the seeds of every future mummy movie and the mythologization of the curse.
Carnarvon, it appeared, had paid the price for desecrating an ancient Egyptian tomb.
He who robs the graves of Egypt dies.
I think society felt at some fairly deep level these archaeologists had it coming to them, that because this taboo had been broken, they were going to be punished. They ought to be punished for it. A kind of desecration was going on.
Whatever the answer, the threat of a curse does little to deter the millions of tourists who visit Egypt every year. Here, they enjoy the peace and tranquility of the Nile and lose themselves in the world of the ancient Egyptians. The mysteries surrounding Tutankhamun are a special draw. This land of ancient wonders is also a mecca for archaeologists, known as Egyptologists. They come not to look for the curse, but to find out more about the ancient Egyptians. British scientist Dr. Aidan Dodson is one of them. He dismisses the notion of a curse. Instead, he's fascinated by the life and death of Tutankhamun. Dodson travels to Egypt from Britain's University of Bristol to solve one of the biggest riddles in archaeology.
I adore Egypt. When I get off the plane in Luxor or Cairo, I always feel very, very comfortable. It's a country where I just feel at home. I like the place, I like the people of now, and I also like the people who I study in the past.
It is more than 3,000 years since Tutankhamun died. Yet Dodson is determined to find out what happened to him. He starts here, in the ancient city of Luxor. At the time of Tutankhamun's death, this great city was the capital of ancient Egypt. It was called Thebes and was the most famous city in the world. Luxor sits opposite the Valley of the Kings on the banks of the River Nile. In Tutankhamun's time, this mighty river was the country's main artery. Dodson knows that the Nile played a vital role in the rituals that followed the death of Tutankhamun. He can also find significant clues about Tutankhamun in Luxor's Temple of Karnak. Sprawling over 200 acres, it is still the biggest temple ever built. Once, the pharaohs of ancient Egypt walked this magnificent hall with its 169 pillars. Today, it challenges the minds of the millions of tourists who visit Karnak every year. The temple holds vital clues for scientists like Dodson. He's trying to answer the question, who was this boy king? And piece together what happened at the time of Tutankhamun's death. For centuries, the only clues lay in the statues of Tutankhamun, like this one at Karnak.
Before Tutankhamun's tomb was found, we knew very little about him. We knew his name, we knew when he lived, we knew nothing about his relationships, his age, or anything like that.
The discovery of the tomb answered many questions. But of most interest was Tutankhamun's body, preserved for eternity by the death rituals of the high priests of ancient Egypt. The body provides invaluable evidence to scientific sleuths like Dodson.
The Egyptian belief was that for the spirit to survive efficiently in the next world, the body had to survive in this world.
This belief meant that the ancient Egyptians had to ensure that the bodies of their dead lasted forever. To achieve this, they developed a complex set of rituals. When a pharaoh like Tutankhamun died, his body was transported across the River Nile, a journey symbolic of the transition from life to death. Boats sailed towards the setting sun and the afterlife. On the other side of the river, the mummification of Tutankhamun's body could begin. This whole area was an enormous necropolis, a city of the dead. More than 10,000 bodies are buried here. A macabre industry was devoted to the process of mummification, using practices to preserve the dead that are little understood today.
The first thing in mummification was to remove the internal organs. The viscera, the stomach and liver were removed. The brain was then removed via the nose. A narrow chisel would be inserted into the nostril to breaking the bone at the back of the nose. and then a bent wire pushed up there and waggled around a bit would break up some of the brain tissue. If you left it for a couple of days, it would then liquefy, and you're able to pour the brain out through the nose.
The corpse was then covered in salt to drain the body of its fluid. Finally, it was wrapped in linen. Tutankhamun was then buried in the Valley of the Kings, where he would lie in darkness for 3,000 years. Today, Dodson is on his way there in his quest to find out how Tutankhamun died.
The Valley of the Kings has always been almost a holy grail of Egyptologists. There's probably a greater concentration of archaeology here than almost anywhere else in Egypt.
Aidan Dodson is visiting Tutankhamun's tomb in an attempt to find out if the boy king was murdered. He hopes to find vital clues that could help him track down the killer. Dodson knows that the tomb is much smaller than those normally built for a pharaoh, suggesting that Tutankhamun died unexpectedly. But the most important thing was the revelation that Tutankhamun was no more than 20 years old when he died. So, had he been murdered?
From the moment of the discovery, and the discovery that he was a young man when he died, there was speculation of what he died of. But it wasn't until the late 1960s that there were any clues even to a potential cause of death.
In 1968, Tutankhamun's coffin was opened for the first time in 5 decades. The mummy was unwrapped and its head removed. The scientists were about to discover something sinister. An X-ray revealed a fragment of displaced bone at the back of his skull, an indication of a massive blow to the back of the head. This piece of bone could be a sign that Tutankhamun had been murdered. If so, Dodson wants to know who killed him and why.
There's probably 3 candidates one could think of. One is the General Ai, who was Tutankhamun's eventual successor. There was the General Horemheb, who was the king's deputy and was ultimately to succeed Ai as pharaoh. But also there was the king's wife, Ankhesenamun.
Many believe General Ai to be the prime suspect. During Tutankhamun's reign, he was the head of the military. Ai became pharaoh after Tutankhamun died, even though he was not from the same bloodline. A painting on the walls of the tomb suggests that Ai was trying to cover up his guilt.
There's a unique scene of the king's mummy having last rites being paid to it by his successor, King Ai. That scene is not found in any other Egyptian royal tomb, and probably it's Ai trying to emphasise that he was actually doing the right thing as by carrying out the last rites and therefore was the legitimate heir to the throne.
It seems that Ai had a motive for murder. But there are other possible explanations.
Ways of banging your head other than somebody whacking you over the head. Tripping over, hunting accident. It's possible that Tutankhamun may have actually engaged in some warfare, even death in battle.
Whatever the cause of his death, Tutankhamun was buried alongside a vast hoard of treasures. But even these are said to carry the curse. Egypt is one of the most popular destinations in Africa. An important stop for visitors is the capital, Cairo. With its population of almost 17 million, Cairo is one of the biggest and most densely populated cities in the world. Just 30 years ago, this bustling city was the backdrop to a series of deaths that some blamed on the curse of Tutankhamun. After the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922, the treasures were transported to the capital's Egyptian museum. Almost a third of the museum is devoted to Tutankhamun's treasures, which were once crammed into the tiny tomb. And this is one of the most valuable objects in the world. Millions have gazed at it in awe. It's the solid gold death mask chiseled off the face of Tutankhamun. Today, these invaluable treasures are back on display in Cairo. But in 1970, they went on a world tour. With the movement of the treasures, many believed that the curse of the mummy rose again. At the Egyptian Museum, the director of antiquities believed that Tutankhamun's treasures should stay in Egypt. On leaving a meeting on the subject, he stepped into a seemingly clear road. And was killed instantly by a passing car. In 1972, his successor, Dr. Gamal Merez, died of a stroke the night after he had organized the treasures to be sent to England. Ian Lansdowne was one of the Air Force crew that transported the treasures to London. It was a flight the crew would never forget. Each met fateful calamities. Lansdowne fell from a ladder and is crippled to this day. Soon after, the house of the plane's navigator was burnt to the ground, and 2 other crew members suffered fatal heart attacks. Now safely back on display in Egypt, Tutankhamun's treasures hold many clues that may help explain the existence of a curse. Dr. Salima Ikram is an Egyptologist based in Cairo and a world expert on the treasures of Tutankhamun.
Tutankhamun captured the popular imagination because his tomb was filled with gold, and it really emphasizes the grandeur of ancient Egypt and also some of its mystique and exotica.
Ever since Westerners first came to Egypt, they believed the Egyptians held some kind of age-old wisdom that allowed them to weave potent forms of magic.
People always want to believe that the ancient Egyptians had secret, mysterious powers and that they had magic, and I think this desire for the Egyptians to be special is one of the things that has helped generate and keep alive this idea of the curse of the mummy. I think the idea of having magical protection in tombs and having curses and having this great sort of force is something that is been long current in Western culture.
Ikram's research finds no curse of Tutankhamun, but earlier tombs do contain threats to violators.
In Old Kingdom tombs, some curses or warnings really have been found, but they generally threaten people who come in an impure state to be, that they will be punished by the gods of the hereafter and the great god as well as the great council of gods. 1 or 2 texts actually say a great bird will come from the sky and sort of do nasty things to you, and you might be trampled by a hippo, eaten by a crocodile, or stung by a snake or a scorpion. Certainly things like curses and so on, I think, are really more effective if you believe in them.
Ikram puts the spate of sinister deaths down to coincidence rather than strange mystical forces.
Everyone makes a big fuss about how the lights went out when Lord Carnarvon died, but certainly at that time, and even today, the lights go out in Cairo quite a bit. and the dog died, and that's sort of a well-documented fact, because sometimes when someone is in one country and their pet is in another country, for some reason or the other, the pet does feel that its owner has died, and it lets out a wail of anguish and then passes out dead too.
50 years later, when the treasures were shipped to the US, the public still wasn't taking any chances.
In the 1970s, when Tutankhamun's treasures went to the United States, people whose grandparents had traveled in Egypt before and purchased mummies were terribly worried about the curse. So in the mornings, the museum people would find that they had received packages containing boxes filled with mummy fragments that people who were very worried and had sent them back to these museums saying, please take these back to Egypt, because when our grandfather went, he brought back this bit of mummy, and I'm sure it's got a curse on it, because our family fortunes have never been the same since.
But strange events have occurred more recently to those who visit the Valley of the Kings and the ancient tomb of Tutankhamun. Tutankhamun's body lies in a golden coffin shaped in his own image. Ever since its discovery in 1922, people have attributed many strange happenings to his supposed curse. In 1992, Sir Christopher Frayling spent 6 weeks in Egypt filming a television series about the boy king.
Dark forces in the land of the pharaohs.
I was standing in the tomb talking about the corpse of Tutankhamun, and just as I got to the description of the curse, all the lights went out. And you haven't really experienced darkness till you've experienced darkness in a tomb where you can't actually see the entrance. It was incredibly frightening, but I don't think it was the curse. I think we blew the mains.
The film crew moved to Cairo.
The worst thing that happened was that just before we were leaving at this hotel in Cairo, I got into the lift on the 26th floor, and there was a doing, and we started moving down the lift shaft very fast indeed. We went and then stopped, and I got an instant migraine. I was sick when I realised what had happened, and I must admit I looked up just in case the boy king was there with a hacksaw, like in the Phantom of the Opera, you know, cutting through these metal hawsers. I don't think you need the curse to explain it, but I must admit we were absolutely sort of convinced, and we kept saying, oh my God, King Tut's on our tail, and he's going to come and get us for desecrating the tomb. It was quite scary, actually.
But perhaps the high number of deaths relating to the opening of the tomb can be explained in other ways. There is a man who believes that they can. Dr. Nasri Iskander is an Egyptian scientist who specializes in the sealed environments of tombs, as well as the mummies that inhabit them.
I don't believe in that curse, ever in my life. It's all science, and there is another explanation all the way.
Over the course of his career, Dr. Nasri has worked on hundreds of mummies and been inside countless tombs. Today, he's working on the 3,000-year-old mummy of the pharaoh Ramses II. Dr. Nasri has 27 royal mummies in his care, with one notable exception.
We don't have the mummy of Tutankhamun here. It's still there in the tomb itself. But we have his father and maybe his older brother also.
Dr. Nasri's work proves that when a tomb remains sealed for thousands of years, the oxygen is gradually used up by microorganisms inside it. Once the oxygen is exhausted, the microorganisms go into a kind of everlasting hibernation. But when a tomb is breached, everything changes.
Once you start to open the tomb, the oxygen starts to raise again. It activates the bacteria and viruses and fungus. All of them start to move again.
The viruses come back to life with a vengeance and strike down the vulnerable. Perhaps this accounts for the heavy death toll among the elderly gentlemen who were involved in opening the tomb. Considering such risks, Dr. Nasri has been lucky.
To me, I'm working with the mummies for more than 30 years. We are still working, and with no harm to ourselves, me and my team. It's perfect.
But did the ancients know how to harness another fatal force?
Now for one of the mad suggestions. The people who got ill or died by exposure to the tomb were irradiated by uranium poisoning, because part of the mummification process, the brand X, the ingredient X in making sure the mummies lasted forever, was burying them in sand with a high uranium content. The mummies got irradiated. So as you went into the tomb, bottled up in this tomb is all this radiation.
Around the world, some rocks do accumulate radioactivity. And that's true here in the Valley of the Kings. Some scientists have tried to prove that the ancient Egyptians did use radioactivity in the mummification process.
I have in fact been present at a demonstration with a Geiger counter in the anatomy department at Cairo University, where somebody stood there and buzz, 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 buzz. And I mean, I completely accept that nobody quite knows how mummification was done, because the ancient Egyptians were a lot better at it than we are. So yes, there was an ingredient X, but I don't believe that it was radiation.
Mystery still surrounds the death of the boy king Tutankhamun and the existence of his curse.
I mean, you'd think actually that people are a little bit fed up with stories about curses and mummies coming back and everything, but it still seems to have mileage in it, and thereby hangs a tale.
Travelers will never cease to come to the Valley of the Kings, still steeped in ancient magic. And Egypt remains one of the most intriguing countries in the world.
Archaeological expedition headed by a man named Howard Carter sought to uncover the tomb of an ancient Egyptian pharaoh, King Tutankhamun.
November 1922. After years searching, a tomb is unearthed.
Hanging over the excavation party was a pall of superstition that threatened the progress of the expedition at every turn.
A long-lost pharaoh, disturbed and desecrated.
They thought that Egypt was so full of artifacts that they could just go there, dig a hole and take whatever they wanted, and it really, really didn't matter.
A deadly curse, thousands of years old, is awakened.
And it absolutely runs like wildfire.
Those who entered are in grave peril. From the curse of Tutankhamun.
Within a few weeks, his father had thrown himself out of a window.
It's now almost 100 years since the tomb of the world's most famous pharaoh was discovered. Tutankhamun.
Tutankhamun, he wasn't an important guy, he wasn't an important pharaoh. He died very young, he didn't rule for very long. It's absolutely bizarre, in a way, that he should end up the most famous of all the pharaohs.
In 2019, an exhibition of his treasures attracted hundreds of thousands of visitors. It remains the greatest archaeological find of all time.
But with Tutankhamun, you've got everything. You've got the mummy, the death mask, and all of his treasures. And the treasures are weirdly intimate things, you know, his walking sticks, because he was lame, his games, his toys. There are some boomerangs here. We know him, we know him, and we love him. Ancient Egypt was the first visually compelling and beautiful civilization. It's incredible. It comes out of the Stone Age and it evolves by the Nile in this kind of very organic way. And they produce true beauty and sublimity, actually, grandeur, aesthetic grandeur, maybe for the first time in human civilization.
Certainly the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922 attracts attention still because it was an archaeological adventure. There's a sense of the intrepid, a sense of a real glamour, again, because of the time that it happened in the 1920s. So it's not simply what they found, it was the manner that it was found in and the way that is framed, the way it was photographed, the way it was sold in the popular press.
But our fascination with Tutankhamun has always been tinged with fear and danger. The notion of a curse, the vengeance of a long-dead pharaoh, persists.
It's beautiful, it's powerful, it's great art, but there's some kind of idea in it which is really intense, that a real belief that this stuff matters, and it is meant to have magical power. And so maybe there is just something spooky and slightly inexplicable about Egyptian art and the Egyptian dead that does make us, you know, believe in curses and mummies and so forth.
Widespread enthusiasm for ancient Egypt began over 200 years ago.
The Europeans had a very kind of clear taste that was nearly all classical, so Roman and Grecian. And they thought that Egyptian sculpture was just, and architecture was just awful, tasteless, primitive. And that totally changed in 1798 when Napoleon invaded Egypt. And there was a sudden kind of rush of awareness about the extraordinary culture that was there and rotting away in the deserts. And when that stuff started coming in massive quantities to Europe, then there was a sudden burst of what we now call Egyptomania.
It's a bit strange because some of them brought back mummies, and you know, you wouldn't normally think of going on holiday and bringing back human remains as a souvenir, but they did this. And it wasn't even unknown to have a mummy unwrapping party, and people would come and watch the mummy be unwrapped.
So you would go to the Royal Institution in 1830s and see a mummy literally disassembled. So unwrapped, chiseled away at, ripped apart. And what they're looking for really is the jewels that are bound into the wrappings of the mummy.
Ancient Egypt intrigues us, fascinates us, horrifies us because of the status of mummified flesh. And that chance to, rightly or wrongly, see the face of an ancient Egyptian, the preserved flesh of an ancient Egyptian, puts Egypt in a special category. That fired the imagination in a way between real rapture at seeing this and excitement and revulsion.
By the mid-19th century, popular fiction was feeding this twin fascination.
So in 1869, we have Louisa May Alcott, most famous for writing Little Women, writes a short story called Lost in a Pyramid. And Lost in a Pyramid not only has a mummy, but it has the first time a curse. And mummies and curses thereafter seem to go hand in hand. I think far and away the more influential piece is Arthur Conan Doyle's Lot Number 249. And in that we have the first real representation of an enormous bandaged juggernaut of a mummy battering its way through the leafy countryside of Oxfordshire and killing people in its way.
By the early 20th century, fiction became film, and the idea of Egyptian tombs harboring supernatural forces was firmly established in the public's mind. It was in this atmosphere that a young British archaeologist would make the greatest discovery of all time and unleash an evil curse. By the end of the 19th century, ancient Egypt was attracting a new wave of professional archaeologists. They included Howard Carter,
First Egyptologists were basically, I think, what we would classify today almost as tomb robbers. They thought that Egypt was so stuffed full of artifacts that they could just go there, dig a hole and take whatever they wanted, and it really, really didn't matter. But about the time that Howard Carter came, there was a definite change. Things became more scientific. And Howard Carter seems to have adapted very well to that new approach to Egyptology. We don't get the sense that he went in and ripping things apart, just looking for that one particular find that would be worth, you know, thousands.
Carter first arrived in Egypt in 1891, working on archaeological digs as a painter.
Howard Carter was an artist, and a very good artist. His father was an artist too, and he became interested in ancient Egypt because he had a neighbour who had an extensive Egyptian collection.
He immediately fell in love with the country and became recognised as a gifted Egyptologist.
Carter had a massive career boost. He moved suddenly from just being somebody who excavated and did artistic work to becoming an inspector of the Antiquities Service. He went to Luxor and became in charge of all the archaeological sites in southern Egypt, and he did a really good job.
The archaeological jewel of southern Egypt was the Valley of the Kings, the burial site of 18th dynasty pharaohs.
So that's an area in western Thebes, modern Luxor. It's behind a range of hills, the Theban mountains, but behind these set of hills, there's this quiet area, the place of truth, where the kings are actually buried.
But archaeologists had unearthed few artifacts from the pharaohs' tombs in the valley. Ancient Egyptian grave robbers had beaten Western treasure hunters to it by millennia.
The Valley of the Kings was home to a lot of royal tombs, and these tombs were repeatedly robbed. They were robbed pretty soon after the burials of the kings. Everyone knew that the tombs in the Valley of the King had been emptied. For almost 100 years, people have been looking at them, they've been finding tombs, finding nothing in them.
But Howard Carter was convinced there was one pharaoh's tomb that hadn't been robbed.
Howard Carter knew the list of the kings of the 18th dynasty, and he knew that some of those kings had a tomb. Some also had a body, because collections of royal bodies had been found. So he was able to go down the list and say, well, this king has a tomb, and this king has a body, and this king has both. The only king who Carter would have expected to be buried in the valley and who had neither a body nor a tomb was Tutankhamun. So Howard Carter knew that he was missing, and if he was going to look for an 18th dynasty king, it would be Tutankhamun.
Tutankhamun was one of the last pharaohs of 18th dynasty royalty. His reign lasted little more than a decade.
Tutankhamun came to the throne at a very strange time. His predecessor, Akhenaten, had decided to change the whole focus of the monarchy and had worshipped just one god, the Aten, the sun disk. Tutankhamun, when he came to the throne, reversed that decision. We know that he came to the throne at about 8 years of age, and we know that after he'd done this, the old gods were reinstated. So, if you like, he's a king who restores Egypt. We also know that he married his sister or his stepsister, but beyond that, we don't know a great deal about him.
By his late teens, the young pharaoh was dead.
Tutankhamun's reign was never forgotten. There were statues of Tutankhamun and his name was dotted about Egypt, but his tomb was forgotten. There was a massive flood in the Valley of the Kings. The bottom of the valley where Tutankhamun was buried was covered in a layer of mud, and it was essentially forgotten.
But to find Tutankhamun's tomb required money, and plenty of it. What Howard Carter needed was a sponsor.
The 5th Earl of Carnarvon is normally portrayed as the financier behind Howard Carter and the discovery of Tutankhamun, a playboy who sort of threw money at it. And that's about it.
After a near-fatal car accident, Lord Carnarvon would convalesce every winter in Egypt, a country under British control.
Egypt was this playground, really, for wealthy Europeans. And you would have aristocrats swanning around, lots of journalists, lots of military people, lots of writers and socialites. So it was a whole social scene.
When Cairo's colonial club life wore thin, Lord Carnarvon began to show an interest in Egyptology.
Lots of people are interested in Egyptology because they think that the Egyptians have a knowledge that we're lacking, particularly in our very scientific, very modern age. There's this feeling that maybe the people of the past, the Egyptians with their mysterious mummies and pyramids and so on, actually had an understanding that we are lacking today. Part of this process is the idea of the curse, that they could create a curse that would have effect many, many years later.
By 1917, Lord Carnarvon had teamed up with Howard Carter and bought the rights to excavate in the Valley of the Kings. The search for Tutankhamun had begun.
They made an ideal team because one had the expertise and one had the money. And they started to work together.
In the shadows of the Silent Sphinx and the gigantic pyramids that stood as lonely sentinels over the vast stretch of burning sand, an English archaeological expedition headed by a man named Howard Carter sought to uncover the tomb of an ancient Egyptian pharaoh, King Tutankhamun.
Howard Carter's archives are now held at the Griffiths Institute in Oxford.
So this is Howard Carter's map of a section of the Valley of the Kings.
It's written up here, Valley of the Kings by Carter. So Carter gridded up this section of the valley, and he was asking his men to dig down to bedrock in every square, and he's drawn in the tombs that they already knew about, and also some of the geological features. Also got the tomb of Ramesses VI here, which was a very large tomb. So Carter's map here is kind of indicative of the way that he worked, and that he's gridded everything up very carefully, and he's methodically working through each square to make sure that he doesn't miss anything.
Hanging over the excavation party was a pall of superstition that threatened the progress of the expedition at every turn. Fighting that feeling as well as the blazing desert sun, Carter ruled with an iron fist and was hard-pressed to keep the work going.
The English excavators, I think, tried to see themselves as scientists. And they knew that they were surrounded by Egyptian workers who had a set of beliefs that really this was transgressive in some way, that you were breaking into what was holy space.
But 5 years of looking for the lost tomb of Tutankhamun delivered only disappointment.
So as Carter's written here, Carnarvon excavation seasons, he started in 1917, and we've got 18, 19, 20, 21. They'd found very little for those 5 years that they'd been digging, and it was getting to the point where Carnarvon was running out of money, and things would have been quite tense. The pressure would have been on for Carter to try and find something to make all this excavation and all this money worthwhile.
So in June 1922, Carnarvon and Carter sat down here, probably in his Egyptian room, amongst all the extraordinary collection of treasures, and Lord Carnarvon was saying to Howard Carter, I cannot continue to fund the expeditions in Egypt on an ongoing basis, and he needed to give him notice.
So he said to Lord Carnarvon, look, I just have one square on my map left. Please, can I have one more season? He even offered to finance it himself, and then I'm happy to say that there's nothing left in the valley.
So Lord Carnarvon, ever the gambler and ever the generous patron, said basically, OK, one last season.
(1922) would be Carter's last chance to find Tutankhamun.
So this is what we call Carter's pocket diary for his Egyptian season 1922, that at the time Carter believed would be his last season working in the Valley of the Kings. So 27th of October 1922, left Cairo for Luxor. And he always writes quite neatly on the line. The 1st of November 1922, he's just recorded commenced excavations BLM, Biban El Maluk, which is the Valley of the Kings. And then very quickly, we have on the 4th of November 1922, Carter's entry is one of the few where he's written across the page diagonally. And this is Howard Carter excited. And he's simply written, first steps of tomb found. And then when he had time, he would write in his journal, which gives a much fuller account of what happened. This is the entry for November the 5th, 1922. Towards sunset, we had cleared down to the level of the 12th step,
which was sufficient to expose a large part of the upper portion of the plaster and sealed doorway. Here before us was sufficient evidence to show that it really was an entrance to a tomb.
And by the seals, to all outward appearances, that it was intact. So for Carter, this must have been something that he probably didn't even dream about, to find a tomb that was still sealed.
Beyond those 12 steps descending through the bedrock to a sealed doorway lay a passageway which took Carter down to another sealed entrance, beyond which lay an antechamber, an annex, and the burial chamber. Throughout the tomb were references to the pharaoh buried inside, Tutankhamun. The morning that Carter first entered the tomb, a hawk was spotted flying above the excavation site. His Egyptian workforce considered it a bad omen. Within 4 months, the financier Lord Carnarvon would be dead. After 5 years of excavating in Egypt's Valley of the Kings, archaeologist Howard Carter and his team had found the long-lost tomb of Tutankhamun. The Griffiths Institute holds over 1,000 glass plate photographs taken inside the tomb.
So we have in front of us a glass negative, one of several thousand created by the photographer Harry Burton, who was assigned to Carter's team right from the beginning of the excavation. So this is the first room that they entered in the tomb of Tutankhamun. All of these objects were just as if they had been placed over 3,000 years ago. So on the left-hand side, you can see we have the dismantled chariots of the king for use in the afterlife. And then moving round to the right, we can see 2 gilded couches, or 3 gilded couches found in the tomb. And upon those couches are heaped furniture, so we have chairs and stools, as well as boxes which contained items such as the king's garments and also even a medicine set. Then looking underneath the couches, we see even more furniture. You can just about see the throne of the king, child size. And then moving along to the next couch, we can see these oval-shaped boxes which were found to contain cuts of meat.
So it's the first major archaeological find, really, to use photography in a very stylized way. We know the find through the photographs, and it really was an aesthetic that, yes, Carter contributed to, but which Harry Burton invented.
With thousands of grave goods to remove, catalogue and restore, the task ahead was monumental.
Carter was prepared to take years if necessary because he wanted to do it correctly, because he recognised that in excavating Tutankhamun's tomb, he would be destroying it. You could never recreate it, so he knew he had to get it absolutely right. So he did things that hadn't really been done before. He assembled a big team of experts and he planned out a methodology, which was so good that we can still use his cards today to see what he was found and where.
On the 29th of November 1922, the discovery was officially announced to the press. The golden funerary objects emerging into the sunlight energized a world depleted after the Great War and Spanish flu.
The timing was good, I think, because it was after the war and it was also after the influenza epidemic. So the world really needed cheering up, and everybody loves a story of action and adventure and discovery and treasure.
This is the beginning of the 20s. This is the beginning of the era of wealthy socialites and flappers and new freedoms, and also of kind of decadence, and the F. Scott Fitzgerald Great Gatsby era is beginning. And perhaps Tutankhamun, with his glitter and his bling and his youth, is the Jazz Age pharaoh.
The delicate grave goods, over 3,000 years old, mesmerized, inspired, and enlightened.
You're suddenly looking on the face of a king who hasn't been seen for thousands of years. His perfect tomb, his perfect treasures, his gorgeous art, and it was all to do with helping the soul, or the spirit, to make its journey through the afterlife. There's nothing lacking from what the Egyptians could do in art, and that's what you really realise, I think, looking at Tutankhamun's treasures. It's a time capsule of a lost artistic wonderland, which must have been just incredible.
One prominent journalist present at the opening of the tomb was Arthur Weigel.
Arthur Weigel was really a rival Egyptologist to Howard Carter. So for years, he had been telling stories about the Valley of the Kings, about hauntings, about mysterious, vengeful events that were associated with particular tombs. So he was perfectly situated to tell a story about Tutankhamun. And he was employed by the Daily Mail at the news of the opening of the Tutankhamun tomb to go out there and get as many stories as he could related to this. So he was kind of an authority figure, an expert, but also someone who understood that sensational stories would really sell.
When Carnarvon is present at the public opening of the tomb, he does it with such bravado, such excitement, such a devil-may-care attitude that Arthur Weigel, the reporter who's standing on the sidelines, says if he continues in this frame of mind, he would be lucky to last 6 weeks. This is really the seeding of the curse story from this very, very early point.
Weigel's off-the-cuff remark would turn out to be prophetic. With the media frenzy interrupting the excavation's progress, Lord Carnarvon decided to sign an exclusive deal with the Times newspaper, appointing them as sole agent for all reporting inside the tomb.
But of course, it enraged all the other journalists, and it particularly enraged the Egyptian journalists from the Egyptian newspapers, because they could only learn what was happening in a tomb of one of their dead kings by reading about it in the Times of London.
There's a huge media circus that fundamentally is kind of locked out of the event. So that every other newspaper sends along people to try and get as much information as they can, subvert the whole situation.
Well, bud, good luck to you. Get back in 21 days or less.
I'll do it.
And they published stories from experts, and these experts weren't actual experts because the experts were in the tomb. So the experts that they consulted were sort of fringe Egyptologists, people like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle or Marie Corelli or Rider Haggard. And of course, these people were interested in the elementals, in the spirits, in the occult versions of Egypt rather than the actual practicalities of the dig.
In February 1923, after the opening of the burial chamber, an exhausted Lord Carnarvon took some time out with his daughter, Evelyn.
So he rented a dahabaya and he decided to sail up towards Aswan, to sail on the Nile and have a few days of rest. Unfortunately, as he sailed, he was bitten by a mosquito on his left cheek. And instead of dabbing it with iodine, he nicked it with his razor when he was shaving, and it became infected.
Evelyn brought her father back to Luxor, where his condition worsened.
So then she took him up to Cairo, where there were better doctors, but I think he was stressed and exhausted. He got probably a form of septicemia. It probably went to his lungs. And then sadly he died on April the 6th, 1923.
The moment he died, Cairo was plunged into darkness.
And by some mischance or not, the lights in Cairo did go out on that night. And actually his dog Susie howled and died back here at the same time. So it is, I suppose maybe I just think of it as a respect for the past. We don't know what happens after we die. It does seem to me so sad that Lord Carnarvon died in the hour of his triumph. He had made the most extraordinary discovery of all time.
With Lord Carnarvon's sudden death, the press, excluded from the tomb, now had a story they could run wild with.
Dateline, Egypt. Visitors flocked to the open tomb, attracted as much by the legendary curse as of the chance to step into a chamber of the far distant past. Mystics the world over, led by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, cried out that the tomb's curse had claimed its desecrator.
It's difficult to imagine a more perfect storm in the sense of the creation of a cursed narrative than Lord Carnarvon's death in 1923, hot on the heels of course, the discovery of the tomb. And it fits a preconceived narrative of mystery, of danger, of threat, and it absolutely runs like wildfire through the popular press.
It was in the Valley of the Tombs that Howard Carter and his expedition party first discovered the tomb of King Tut in 1922. In the dead king's crypt was the inscription, "Death shall come with swift wings to him who touches the tomb of the pharaoh."
We also, as a culture, really like stories about bad luck befalling very rich people. We love it. That's what the whole of tabloid culture is about. Build people up and then destroy them. That kind of sense of revenge, of justice, of a kind of natural justice that is hitting back. Curse stories are nearly always told by the poor, the oppressed, about their masters.
As Tutankhamun's body was removed from his burial chamber, the public in increasing numbers believed that Carnarvon had paid the price for disturbing the dead pharaoh.
It was only when the body was discovered that it suddenly became very apparent that this was a young man. Particularly being close to the First World War, it really sort of made people feel they could relate to him. People started to ask, was it actually right that Egyptologists should be digging up dead people, looking at their bodies and so on? Should we not be letting these people rest in peace?
The war had also piqued an interest in spiritualism.
So we have a group of letters, a one-sided correspondence, in fact, because as far as we're aware, Carter never replied to these letters, but they were sent by a lady who adopted the name Stella Maris, and we believe that she was a renowned psychic, a spiritualist.
Brothers, We have met today. Many may wonder at the true purpose of this cooperation. In the time that is to come, national life must cease.
Spiritualism would have been very popular during this period, following the First World War, where a lot of young men died. So parents, wives were very keen to reconnect with the recently departed. Stella writes, I believe that Lord Carnarvon owes his death to the fact that the tomb of Tutankhamun was opened without any ceremonies calculated to placate any car or cars. And she says that to satisfy the spirits which were guarding the tomb, that an offering of wine, oil and milk should be poured on the threshold, and then Carter and his team would be able to proceed without any further hindrance.
Carter dismissed the curse as ridiculous and continued working inside the tomb, while the press outside pursued it relentlessly. It would be a matter of weeks before Tutankhamun would claim his next victim. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb had become tainted by rumors of a curse, and the pharaoh's victims were immediately reported by the world's press. In May 1923, George J. Gould, an American railroad magnate, died of pneumonia after visiting the tomb. July that same year, Egyptian playboy Prince Ali Fahmy Bey, after seeing the tomb, was later shot by his wife in the Savoy Hotel. Key members of Carter's team soon followed.
It's well known that Howard Carter's account of the whole opening of the tomb was co-written by another Egyptologist, Arthur Mace, and within a year, Arthur Mace had had this major physical breakdown and had to retire from Egypt entirely. And he went back to New York and he died in 1928. The person who worked with Howard Carter to X-ray and photograph some of the artifacts was Sir Archibald Reed, and he died in January 1924. And then there was a French Egyptologist, very eminent, called Georges Benedict, and he had inspected the tomb and fell very badly outside on the steps and died in 1926.
Others soon followed.
Lord Carnarvon's secretary was called Richard Bethel, and he died in mysterious circumstances in 1929, thought to have committed suicide in his London club. And the great confirmation of that story was that his father had heard this news and had kind of cried, "It's the curse of the mummy, the curse of the mummy." And within a few weeks, his father had thrown himself out of a window and died as well.
Within 10 years of the discovery, 13 deaths had been linked to the curse. But while the press lapped up such stories, others were skeptical. Some of those who died had never even visited Egypt.
So it came to a point almost where anybody who had any connection at all with Tutankhamun or his tomb and then met a mysterious or unexpected end, it was attributed to the curse. American Egyptologist Herbert Winlock got fed up of hearing these stories, so he decided to do some research. And he looked at the people who'd been present in the tomb at various times. And basically he worked out that of all those people who were there, the death rate was completely as expected. There was no disproportionate number of people dying.
But if there is no curse, what of the tablet inscription reported to have been found inside the tomb?
In the dead king's crypt was the inscription, "Death shall come with swift wings to him who touches the tomb of the pharaoh."
To the story that there was a tablet found within the tomb that said death comes on swift wings, I think we can put no credence to it whatsoever.
In ancient Egypt, tomb warnings were only found in private civilian tombs, not royal tombs.
So Egyptian tombs, at least for private individuals, weren't hidden. They were very open and required visitors to come to them. The tomb wasn't just a place where you deposited a body and forgot about it. It was a place which actually served as the home for the spirit. There'd be the burial chamber, and then there's the offering chapel, and that's very much where threats connected to tombs are situated. The idea is that if you behave badly in a tomb or towards a tomb, particularly the physical structure of the tomb, bad things will happen to you. Royal tombs were completely the opposite. The sort of threats that you would see in private tombs, you actually wouldn't get in a royal tomb. Tombs in the Valley of the Kings were not open to general visitors to come along and make offerings. And that's partly because the king is very different to everybody else.
The curse inscription, supposedly discovered inside Tutankhamun's tomb, has never been found. It took 10 years for Howard Carter to remove Tutankhamun's funerary objects from the grave. The man most responsible for disturbing the pharaoh then lived to the age of 64, before dying of natural causes. For almost 100 years, curse stories have been entwined with our love of Tutankhamun. And as his artifacts are returned to Egypt, they show no sign of fading.
I think fundamentally people do love to have not everything explained to them because it allows a little bit of interpretation. And it's that bit of interpretation that's the ghost story, that's the curse story. And as long as there is that space in the narrative, the curse will always exist side by side with a rational explanation. And that will only continue to fuel our interest in ancient Egypt.
Given a new lease of life in Dubai, the QE2 has had a refurb and it's ready for guests once again. The new world's most luxurious hotel is tomorrow at 9. 20 years on since its doomed flight, we examine Concorde's 120 seconds to disaster next.